Silas Crowder didn't even look at her when he kicked the tin cup out of her hand. The coins scattered across the dirt like they were nothing, like she was nothing. He stepped over her outstretched legs the way a man steps over a dead branch, without breaking stride, without a single second of hesitation. The woman flinched but didn't cry out. She had stopped crying out a long time ago. She just pulled her knees to her chest, clutched the worn cloth rabbit against her heart, and started humming. Low and quiet. The kind of sound a person makes when the world has beaten everything else out of them except the music they learned before the world turned cruel. That was the moment 9-year-old Tobias Blackwood stopped walking. His father kept moving for 3 more steps before he realized his son wasn't beside him anymore. "Tobias!" Gideon didn't turn around. "Come on!" The boy didn't move. And in the space of that single frozen second, one child standing still on a dusty Saturday afternoon while his father's patience wore thin and the whole busy street moved around them like a river around a stone. Everything that had been broken for 8 years began, without warning, to crack open again. If that were your child standing there, if that were your wife in the dirt, what would you have done? Before you answer, make sure you stay until the very end, because what Gideon Blackwood discovered that afternoon will shake you to your core. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The Saturday market in Red Mesa Crossing was the kind of controlled chaos that frontier towns depended on to feel alive. Wagons packed the main street from the feed store all the way down to the bank. Women moved between stalls with baskets on their arms. Men argued prices over barrels of flour and coils of rope. And children wove through every gap they could find, because children always find the gaps adults forget exist. Gideon Blackwood moved through all of it, the way powerful men always move through crowds. And the crowd let him. People stepped aside without being asked. A few nodded. Nobody smiled at him exactly, but nobody looked away too fast either. That was the particular kind of respect that came not from affection, but from 8 years of watching a man outlast every bad season, every rival, and every whisper of misfortune that the territory had thrown at Blackwood Ranch. Gideon wasn't loved. He was acknowledged. In Red Mesa Crossing, that passed for the same thing. He had one hand resting on Tobias's shoulder and a list of ranch supplies turning over in his head. Harness leather, 2 new axe handles, salt blocks. He moved on instinct through the noise, half his mind already back at the ranch, calculating how long the afternoon would take and whether they'd make it home before the wind shifted. He didn't see the woman at first. Most people didn't. She was sitting behind the mercantile, between the back wall and a stack of empty crates that someone had shoved there and forgotten. Her clothes were wrong for the season. Thin cotton in October weather, the kind of wardrobe that accumulates when you take what's given and stop expecting anything better. Her hair had been dark once. Now it was a rough tangle of gray-brown that fell across her face like a curtain. She didn't have the energy to push aside. She had a tin cup in front of her, a few coins inside, and she was humming. That was what stopped Tobias. Not the sight of her. He had seen hungry people before. The frontier didn't protect children from that reality. But the sound. Something in the melody caught him like a hand on the collar. He stopped mid-step, and his small face went through 3 different expressions in the space of a second. Confusion, then concentration, then something much harder to name. Gideon had already moved past him. He was 3 steps ahead before he registered the absence of weight at his side, the missing small footfall. He turned around. "Tobias! Come on, son. We've got to—" "Father!" The boy's voice was strange, too quiet, too careful. Gideon walked back to him, already preparing the particular tired patience that single fathers develop when their children see something fascinating in every doorway. He reached down to take Tobias by the shoulder. Then he heard it too. The humming. It was the kind of melody that doesn't have a name because it was never meant to be written down. Just a thing a woman sang to a baby in a dark room late at night, improvised in the small hours from something half-remembered, stitched together from instinct and exhaustion and love. The kind of song that lives inside a person rather than in the air. Gideon had not heard it in 8 years. His hand tightened on Tobias's shoulder, harder than he meant to. "Father?" Tobias didn't look up at him. He was still staring at the woman. "She's humming Mama's song." Gideon's first thought, and he would hate himself for it later, in the quiet of a sleepless night was that his son was wrong, that this was grief doing what grief does, which is find faces and voices in strangers, reach for the familiar in places where only coincidence lives. Tobias had been 9 months old when Evelyn disappeared. He had no conscious memory of his mother, no clear image, no stored voice, just the lullaby Gideon had sung to him from memory, night after night, in the exhausted hope that some thread of it might reach his son from somewhere deep in the past. He was going to say, "Son, lots of women know songs like that." He was going to take the boy by the hand and keep walking. He didn't, because the woman shifted, pulling her knees tighter against her chest, and the cloth rabbit she was holding turned slightly in her grip. And even through the grime and the years and the impossible mathematics of the moment, Gideon felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. The rabbit was handmade. Uneven stitches down one ear, a button eye on the left, slightly higher than the one on the right, a small red thread bow that had faded to almost pink. He had sat beside his wife while she made that rabbit. He remembered the needle pulling through the fabric, remembered the way she'd bitten her lip when the ear came out lopsided, and then laughed and said the imperfection made it better. He crouched down. Not gracefully, more like his knees just stopped holding him the right way. He went down onto one knee in the dirt, 5 feet from the woman, and he looked at her the way you look at something when you are not yet ready to trust your own eyes. She didn't look up. She was somewhere else inside her own mind, the humming barely a breath, the rabbit held against her collarbone like a lifeline. "Ma'am." Nothing. "Ma'am." His voice cracked on the second try. He cleared his throat. Could you look up at me?" She lifted her face slowly. She looked at him the way people look at strangers when they are very tired and slightly afraid, direct but distant, like she was watching him through glass. Her eyes were gray-green. Evelyn's eyes had been gray-green. Gideon's mouth went dry. He told himself, "Gray-green eyes are not uncommon. Don't do this. Don't be a fool in the middle of the street." He told himself that. Then he reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and he turned her left wrist gently so the underside faced upward. The scar was there, crescent-shaped, 3 inches long, thin and silver with age, running from just below her wrist bone toward the heel of her palm. She had cut herself on a piece of broken glass during their first summer together, the summer before the wedding, when they were still learning the shape of each other. And he had held her hand over the wash basin while she insisted it wasn't that bad, and bled everywhere insisting it. He had carried the memory of that scar like a closed fist inside his chest for 8 years. His fingers were trembling against her wrist. She looked down at his hand on her arm. She didn't pull away. She just looked, like she was trying to remember if she was supposed to feel something. "What's your name?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. When she answered, her voice was rough from disuse, a low scratch of sound that barely carried. I've had different names." A pause. "People call me Clara now." "Clara," he repeated. "How long have you been in Red Mesa?" 2 weeks, maybe?" She tilted her head slightly. "I don't always count good." Tobias had gone very still beside his father. He was staring at the woman with the focused intensity that children have before they learn to disguise their feelings. His small hands balled at his sides, his eyes too bright. Gideon stood up slowly. His knee popped, and he ignored it. He looked down the street, then back at her. He looked at the tin cup. He looked at the rabbit. He looked at the scar. He made a decision that the rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 8 brutal frontier years, screamed was insane. "Can you stand up?" he said. She blinked. "What? Can you stand? I want to help you." He stopped. Started again. "I want to take you somewhere. Somewhere warm. Somewhere to eat." He paused. "There's something I need to understand, and I can't understand it from down there." She studied him for a long moment with those gray-green eyes. She wasn't simple. Whatever else had happened to her, he could see that clearly. She was careful. The look she gave him before she decided to trust him even slightly was the look of someone who had paid a high price for trusting quickly. Then she reached out and took the hand he hadn't realized he was offering. He helped her up. She was thinner than he could stand to calculate. Her grip was weak, but her back straightened the moment she was on her feet, with the instinctive dignity of someone who had once carried themselves a particular way and couldn't quite forget how. Two men passing on the other side of the street caught sight of Gideon Blackwood, helping a beggar woman to her feet, and slowed down, looked at each other, and kept walking with the particular expression of people filing away gossip they planned to enjoy later. Gideon didn't notice them. He was watching the woman try to find her balance, clutching the cloth rabbit against her chest, her bare feet in the dirt, her gray-streaked hair falling forward again. He was watching her, and he was doing math that didn't work. 8 years, a flash flood, a body that was never recovered, a child raised without his mother, a ranch held together through sheer iron stubbornness, and he was coming up with an answer that should have been impossible. "All right," she said quietly. "Lead on." Tobias reached over and, without saying anything at all, took her other hand. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. Neither of them said a word. Later, Gideon would try to describe that moment to Coulter Shaw, his foreman, and find that language was inadequate. He would say something like, "It was like watching two people recognize each other from a dream neither of them could fully remember." And Shaw, who was not a sentimental man, would look away for a moment before answering. Because even a man like Shaw understood that some moments don't have the right words. They walked back through the market, the three of them, and the crowd did part, the way it always did for Gideon Blackwood. Only this time, people didn't just step aside out of habitual deference. They stared. By the time they reached Blackwood Ranch, the sun was already slanting low and orange across the scrubland. The housekeeper, a practical woman named Dot, who had kept the ranch running through 8 years of a grief-hollowed employer, opened the door and went completely still. She didn't say anything. Gideon said, "Heat some water, find her some clothes, give her something to eat." Dot looked at the woman, then at Gideon, then at Tobias. "Mr. Blackwood, please, Dot." Something in his voice closed off the argument. Dot pressed her lips together, nodded once, and led the woman inside without further comment, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing Dot had done in 8 years of service. Gideon stood in the doorway a moment longer. He pressed his fist against the frame, forehead following, his eyes closed. He wasn't a man who prayed. He wasn't a man who indulged in hope without evidence. He had built everything he had on the understanding that the world was not fair, and sentiment was a luxury that cost you more than you could afford. But standing there in the failing light, with the sound of Dot filling the water basin and Tobias's quiet footsteps following the woman down the hall, Gideon Blackwood did something he hadn't done in 8 years. He let himself want it to be true, which terrified him more than anything else that had happened that day. Because if he wanted it and he was wrong, he would not survive being wrong again. So, she ate like someone who had learned to eat carefully, small amounts, slowly, watching the room rather than the food. She held the cloth rabbit in her lap the entire time, one hand resting on it between bites. Dot had found her a clean dress, and with her hair brushed back and her face washed, the change was striking enough that Dot had to leave the room abruptly and stand in the kitchen for several minutes doing nothing in particular. Tobias sat across from her at the kitchen table and watched her with transparent intensity. "What?" she finally asked him. "Nothing," he said quickly. A pause. "You have a rabbit," he said. She looked down at it. "Yes. Someone made me one like it." He hesitated. "For when I was a baby." She looked at him properly then, her brow furrowed. She turned the rabbit over in her hands, studying it the way someone studies something they're trying to place. Not like she didn't know it, but like she did know it and couldn't understand how. "The ear," Tobias said carefully. "One ear's got longer stitching than the other." She turned the rabbit over. Her breathing shifted. "Uneven," she said very quietly. I remember thinking it looked wrong." A long pause. "Then I thought—" She stopped. "Imperfections make it better," Tobias finished. She looked at him. He looked at her. In the doorway, Gideon Blackwood stood very still with both hands pressed flat against his thighs and said nothing, because there was nothing left in his chest that words could get past. The woman's face had gone very pale. Her hands were gripping the rabbit hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "I don't understand," she whispered. Not to Tobias, not to Gideon, to herself, to the empty space in her memory where something enormous should have been. "I don't understand why I know that." Tobias slid off his chair. He walked around the table. He stopped in front of her. I know it too, he said, because my father told me. He said you made me one before. He swallowed. Before you went away. She stared at him. You went away in the flood, Tobias said. His voice was careful in the way that children's voices get when they have practiced saying something many times in private. 8 years ago, I was a baby. The woman's breathing was rapid now. Her eyes had gone somewhere that Gideon recognized. The frantic turning over look of someone trying to unlock a door they can feel but cannot see. I have a son, she said. It wasn't a question, it wasn't a confirmation. It was more like a woman standing at the edge of a chasm, testing whether the word held her weight. Yes, Gideon said from the doorway. She looked at him. He looked at her. And for the first time since she had sat behind that mercantile with her tin cup and her cloth rabbit and her borrowed name, something cracked open behind her eyes. Not memory, not yet, but the shape of memory, the silhouette of something immense pressing against a wall from the other side. I'm so sorry, she said. Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, and the rabbit fell from her lap to the floor without her noticing. Tobias picked it up. He set it carefully back in her hands. Don't be, he said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has made a decision that adults spend lifetimes arriving at. You came back. Outside the window of Blackwood Ranch, Red Mesa Crossing was already talking. By morning, it wouldn't just be talking. It would be choosing sides. By morning, Red Mesa Crossing had already made up its mind. Or rather, it had split itself down the middle the way small towns always do when something happens that they can't explain and can't ignore. The story traveled fast. It always does in a town with one main street and too many people who eat breakfast early. By the time the feed store opened, at least 4 different versions were circulating, each one more dramatic than the last, and none of them entirely accurate. The version Silas Crowder heard, and Crowder always heard things first because he paid people to make sure of it, was that Gideon Blackwood had brought a mentally disturbed vagrant woman into his home and was telling people she was his dead wife. Crowder set down his coffee cup and smiled into the middle distance. He had been waiting 8 years for Gideon Blackwood to make a mistake this size. He just hadn't expected it to arrive looking like a gift. Inside Blackwood Ranch, the morning was quieter and stranger than anything Gideon had experienced in a long time, which was saying something, because the last 8 years had contained more strange mornings than he cared to count. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, gone cold in his hand, and listened to the sounds of a woman moving around in the guest room down the hall. Footsteps. Drawers opening and closing. Once, a long silence that made his chest tighten until he heard her moving again. Dot had laid out a proper breakfast. She had also laid out 3 place settings instead of 2, which she did without comment and without being asked. Gideon noticed it and didn't say anything, and Dot went on as if the extra plate was perfectly ordinary, which was exactly the quality that had made her indispensable for 8 years. Tobias came down early. He was dressed already, hair combed, which was unusual enough on a Sunday morning that Dot raised an eyebrow at him across the kitchen. He sat down at the table, poured himself some milk, and didn't touch it. He just watched the hallway. You're going to stare a hole through that wall, Gideon said. Tobias didn't answer. Then he said, Did she sleep? I don't know, son. Did you? Gideon looked at him. Mind your breakfast. Tobias looked at the untouched coffee in his father's hand. You didn't either, he said, and poured himself some milk with the composure of a much older person. She came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, wearing the clean dress Dot had found her, moving carefully the way people move in unfamiliar spaces when they're not yet sure they have permission to take up room. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the table, the 3 place settings, the breakfast, the coffee, and her expression did something complicated. Good morning, Gideon said. He stood up, because that was what he did, and then he felt slightly ridiculous for it. Good morning, she said. She sat down. She looked at the food. She picked up the fork, set it back down, picked it up again. Her hands were steadier than they had been last night, but only just. Tobias slid the biscuits toward her without looking up from his milk. Thank you, she said. You're welcome, Shem, he said, as if they had been doing this every morning for years. And then they both looked at their plates, and the kitchen was quiet in a way that was almost unbearable and almost peaceful at the same time. Gideon watched her eat, and hated himself slightly for the fact that he was looking for things. Looking for the way she held her knife, which Evelyn had always held wrong, thumb on the blade side instead of the handle, a habit that had driven her own mother to distraction. Looking for the way she'd reach for coffee before food, always coffee first. Looking for the tilt of her head when she was thinking. She held her knife with her thumb on the blade side. She reached for coffee before she touched the biscuit. He looked away. He looked at the window. He told himself that these were small things, and small things could be coincidence, and he needed to be careful because he had a 9-year-old boy sitting at this table who was already too far down a road that might end badly, and one of them needed to be sensible. I was having a very hard time being sensible. "I want to ask you some things," he said. "When you're ready, no rush." She looked at him over the coffee cup. "You want to know if I'm her?" "Yes." She set the cup down. She looked at her hands. "So do I," she said quietly. That was not the answer he had expected. He had been prepared for defensiveness, for confusion, for someone performing a version of Evelyn that didn't quite fit. He had not been prepared for that, for a woman who was sitting with the uncertainty of her own identity, like it was a weight she carried every day, heavy and familiar. "What do you remember?" he asked. "Anything. Doesn't matter what order." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it came out slowly, like she was reading from something faded. "Rose-patterned curtains," she said, "in a bedroom. I can see them very clearly, pink roses and the fabric bunched on the left side because the rod was uneven." She paused. "A horse. Dark bay mare with one white sock. She had a bad habit of biting whoever held her reins too tight." Another pause. "A porch. A swing on the porch that squeaked on the right side. Nobody fixed it." Gideon's jaw was tight. The curtains in the main bedroom of Blackwood Ranch still had the same uneven rod. He had never fixed it. Hadn't been able to make himself change anything in that room for 8 years. The dark bay mare. That horse had died 3 years ago, but she had been Evelyn's horse, and she had bitten Coulter Shaw on the forearm twice before Shaw finally learned to give her slack. The porch swing still squeaked on the right side. "The swing," Tobias said suddenly. He had been so quiet they'd both almost forgotten him. "I try to fix it sometimes. Father always says leave it." She looked at Tobias. Something moved across her face. Pain, or the edge of a memory that almost surfaced and then sank again. "Why does he leave it?" she asked softly, like she was asking Tobias, but the question wasn't really for him. Tobias looked at his father. Gideon said nothing for a moment, then, "Because someone I loved liked to sit on it." The woman looked down at the table. She pressed her lips together very hard. "I want to go outside," she said. I want to see the barn." Gideon stood up. They went out together, all three of them, into the cool October morning. She walked a little ahead, not fast, but with direction, like her feet knew something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. She went past the water trough, past the equipment shed, and stopped at the fence of the horse paddock without being shown where it was. 3 horses were in the paddock. 2 of them moved away when she approached. The third, a tall gray gelding that Gideon had bought 4 years ago and that didn't particularly like anyone, including Gideon, walked directly to the fence and put his nose over the rail toward her hand. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against his face without flinching. "Hello?" she said to the horse. Just that. "Hello." The gray shifted his weight and leaned into her hand. Coulter Shaw had spent 4 years trying to get that horse to trust him and had achieved only grudging tolerance. Gideon stood 6 feet back and watched the horse lean into her hand and decided that the rational part of his brain could shut up. The trouble arrived before noon. Silas Crowder didn't come to Blackwood Ranch himself. He was too smart for that and too fond of his dignity. He sent Judge Emmett Pryor and a man from the territorial office named Hale, along with a letter that used the words vulnerable individual and unlawful custody and psychological manipulation in ways that were very carefully arranged to sound legal without quite being a formal charge. Gideon read the letter standing in his own doorway, and his face did the thing it did when he was very angry, went very still, every muscle deliberately held. Shaw stood behind him, reading over his shoulder, and said a word under his breath that Dot would have objected to if she'd been in earshot. Judge Pryor was a cautious man with cautious eyes who had always tried to stay out of the running war between Blackwood and Crowder, mostly because staying out was better for his health than his appointment. He stood on the porch looking like a man who would genuinely prefer to be somewhere else. "I need to speak with the woman," he said. "She's a guest in my home," Gideon said. "She may be a vulnerable—" "She's a guest in my home," Gideon repeated, and his voice was flat in a way that closed certain doors. "She's not a prisoner. She can speak to you if she wants to, but I'll ask her, not you." Pryor looked at Hale. Hale looked at his letter. Gideon went inside. He found her in the kitchen with Dot, the cloth rabbit on the table between them, and a cup of tea in her hands. She looked up when he came in, and she read his face the way people read weather, quickly and without much deliberate thought. "Someone's here about me," she said. "Yes." He sat down across from her, elbows on the table, which was not how he usually sat at a table, but he was past performing composure. "There's a judge and a territorial official on my porch. Someone's raised a concern that you're here against your will, or that I'm taking advantage of your condition." She was quiet. "You don't have to talk to them," he said. "But if you don't, they may come back with more authority. And I want to be honest with you. I don't know what happens then." She turned the teacup in her hands. "Who sent them?" "A man named Silas Crowder. He's—" Gideon stopped, chose his words. "He has reasons to want me to look bad." She looked at him steadily. "And do you? Look bad?" He held her gaze. "I don't know what you see when you look at this situation. I have a strange woman in my house that I pulled off the street because I think she might be my wife who disappeared 8 years ago, and I have almost no proof except things I can't explain." He spread his hands. "From the outside, I probably look like a man who lost his mind." She was quiet for another long moment. Then she said, "What does it look like from the inside?" He didn't answer right away. Outside, he could hear Pryor saying something to Shaw in a low voice, and Shaw's reply, which was shorter, "Like something I can't walk away from," Gideon said finally, "which is the same problem I've had with my wife since the day I met her." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite recognition. Something more tentative than that. A quality of attention that felt like someone turning their face toward a light they couldn't yet see the source of. "I'll talk to the judge," she said. She stood up, straightened the borrowed dress, picked up the cloth rabbit and held it at her side. She walked to the front door without waiting for Gideon to lead her. He followed. Judge Pryor got to the point quickly, because men like Pryor always get to the point quickly when they're uncomfortable. He asked her name. She told him people called her Clara, but that she wasn't sure that was right. He asked how she came to be at Blackwood Ranch. She told him plainly. A man saw her outside the mercantile and said he thought he recognized her, and she came because she had nothing else to go toward, and she chose to trust him. "Were you coerced at any point?" Pryor asked. "No." "Were you threatened?" "No." "Do you wish to remain here?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the paddock, where the gray gelding was still standing near the fence, as if waiting for her. "Yes," she said. Pryor wrote something down. Hale shifted his weight and said, in the careful tone of a man reading from instructions, "He didn't write, 'Ma'am, there is a concern that your mental state may make it difficult for you to—'" "I am not well," she said crisply. "I know that. I have gaps in my memory that cover years, not days. I have nightmares I can't explain. I sometimes don't know what year it is." She met Hale's eyes without flinching. "But I know when I am afraid of someone, and I know when I am not. I am not afraid here." Hale did not have a follow-up question ready for that. She went back inside. Pryor stood on the porch for a moment, looking at Gideon with the expression of a man recalibrating. "I'll need to file a report," he said. "File what you need to file," Gideon said. Pryor nodded slowly. He looked past Gideon at the door she had gone through. "I hope you're right about this, Blackwood, for her sake, as much as yours." "So do I," Gideon said. That afternoon, the whispers reached a new pitch. By evening, they had become something more organized, because Silas Crowder was organizing them. The story circulating through the saloons and parlors of Red Mesa Crossing by dinner time was no longer simply that Gideon Blackwood had brought home a vagrant woman. It had grown teeth. In Crowder's version, which he delivered in the careful, reasonable tone of a man expressing a concerned opinion rather than a calculated attack, Blackwood was a lonely, grief-broken rancher who had fixated on a disturbed and helpless woman because he couldn't accept his wife's death. It was, Crowder said, sad. He almost sounded like he meant it. There were people who believed him. Some of them had known Gideon long enough to have watched 8 years of grief hollow a man out, and they thought, well, that could do it to a person. That could make you reach for the wrong thing. Some of them had known Evelyn before, the woman she had been, the life she'd had at Blackwood Ranch. And they thought, Evelyn Blackwood is in a churchyard somewhere under 8 years of river silt, and whatever that woman is, she isn't Evelyn. But some people remembered other things. Old Margaret Holt, who had run the seamstress shop for 30 years and who had fitted Evelyn Blackwood for her wedding dress, heard the story over the fence from her neighbor and went very quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What color are her eyes?" And when her neighbor said gray-green, Margaret Holt went inside and didn't come back out for the rest of the evening. The Delaney brothers, who ran the livery stable and who had bought a horse from Gideon back when Evelyn was still alive, told each other privately that the description matched up in ways that felt wrong to dismiss. The elder Delaney said, "A woman doesn't just look like another woman that exact way. Not the scar and the eyes and all of it together." The younger Delaney said, "People see what they want to see." They argued about it for 2 days. What none of them knew, what even Gideon didn't know yet because she hadn't told him, was what the woman was doing in the guest room of Blackwood Ranch in the quiet hours of the night. She was remembering. Not in the way that people usually describe remembering, which tends to sound peaceful, like water clearing. It was not peaceful. It came in fragments, and it came with force, the way things break through walls rather than opening doors. She would be sitting on the edge of the bed, the cloth rabbit in her hands, and a smell would unlock something. The particular mix of leather and wood smoke and something cooler underneath that clung to the air on Blackwood Ranch. And for 3 or 4 seconds she would be somewhere else entirely. Somewhere real. Somewhere that felt like before. A man's voice saying her name like it meant something. Her own hands moving over a horse's flank with the particular practiced assurance of someone who had done it 1,000 times. The squeak of a porch swing, a baby's weight against her chest. And then it would be gone, slamming closed, leaving her sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed with her heart going too fast, and the rabbit pressed against her sternum like a tourniquet. She hadn't told Gideon about this. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because the fragments weren't enough, weren't proof, weren't even quite real, just images that might have been memory, or might have been wishful thinking, or might have been something her battered mind manufactured out of the things she'd already been told. She had learned, wherever she'd been for 8 years, to be careful about what she was certain of. Certainty had cost her before, in ways she couldn't fully recall but whose shapes she could feel like old fractures in cold weather. She stayed up most of that first night. The second day on Blackwood Ranch was when things inside the house became complicated in a different way, because Tobias came home from town where he'd been with Shaw picking up supplies, and his face was carrying something he was trying to hold still. Gideon saw it in the doorway. He said, "What happened?" Not a question. A father reading a child. Tobias handed Shaw the packages and came inside. He sat at the kitchen table, which was apparently becoming the place where all difficult things got set down in this house. He looked at the table surface. Then he said, "Nathan Pryor said his father thinks you've lost your mind, and that the woman is an imposter, and she probably came here on purpose." He paused. "And some of the other kids said she should be locked up in a—" He stopped. "In a what?" Gideon said. "In a place for people who aren't right in the head," Tobias said carefully. "They weren't nice about it." Gideon crossed his arms. He uncrossed them. He was doing the particular internal mathematics of a parent, trying to decide how much of the world's ugliness to defend his child against and how much to acknowledge, because there's no formula for that, and anyone who says there is hasn't tried it. "What did you say?" he asked. Tobias lifted his chin. "I said they didn't know what they were talking about." "And then?" A pause. "And then Nathan said a word about you that I'm not supposed to repeat." "And then?" Tobias looked at the table. "I pushed him." Gideon exhaled through his nose. "I know," Tobias said quickly. "I know I shouldn't have." "No, you shouldn't have." Gideon pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "But I understand why you did. Those are 2 different things, and you need to know that." Tobias looked up. "People are going to say things," Gideon said. "Some of them are going to say things that make you want to push them. Some of them are going to say things that are more hurtful than that, and you're not going to be able to do anything at all. The only thing we can do is know what we know." He stopped. Do you know what you know? Tobias thought about it seriously, the way the boy always thought about things that mattered to him. I know she knew about the rabbit, he said. She knew about the ear and the stitching. She knew about the rose curtains. The gray horse walked up to her first. He paused. And she hums the song. She didn't learn it from someone telling her. You can tell the difference. She hums it like she knows it from the inside. Gideon was quiet. Father, Tobias's voice dropped. Is it okay if I think she's my mother? Not saying it to people, just inside. The question hit somewhere Gideon wasn't braced for. He had been so focused on managing his own hope, keeping it under control, behind glass, not letting it run ahead of what could be proven, that he had somehow failed to reckon with the fact that his 9-year-old son had no such discipline and no good reason to have it. Tobias had never known his mother, had grown up with a photograph and a lullaby, and the particular shape of an absence that had defined the entire geography of his childhood. And now there was a woman in the guest room who knew the rabbit and the curtains and the horse, who carried herself with a dignity that came from somewhere, who hummed the song like she knew it from the inside. Yeah, son, Gideon said. His voice was rougher than he meant it to be. I think that's okay. The week moved in fits and starts after that. The territorial official named Hale came back twice, once with paperwork, once with a doctor from the regional office named Fitch, who was professionally skeptical about everything, which Gideon found exhausting and Shaw found infuriating, and the woman herself found, apparently, manageable. She sat across from Dr. Fitch for 2 hours. She answered his questions about her memory with more patience than Gideon would have managed. Fitch asked her about the gaps, and she described them honestly. Years she couldn't account for, fragments that surfaced without order, a life she could feel the outline of, but not the substance. Fitch took notes and said things like dissociative presentation and traumatic amnesia consistent with prolonged psychological stress, which sounded clinical and weren't entirely unfriendly, even if they weren't the answer anyone needed. At the end of the second hour, Fitch set down his pen and looked at her directly. I want to ask you something outside of my official questions, he said. She waited. Do you believe you're Evelyn Blackwood? She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the gray gelding was standing at the fence again. I believe I knew how to make that rabbit, she said at last. I believe I knew that house before I was shown it. I believe I know this territory. The scrubland, the way the wind moves in October, the smell of this particular land, from the inside, not from someone describing it. She looked at Fitch. What I don't know is how to explain any of that if I'm not her, and I've tried. Fitch looked at her for a long moment. He wrote something on his paper. I'll be honest, he said. I cannot verify your identity, but I also cannot find any evidence that you've been coerced or manipulated into this situation. And nothing you've told me is inconsistent with severe traumatic amnesia in a woman who lived in this community before the event. He paused. That's not a verdict, he said. I know, she said. But thank you for the honesty. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. Judge Pryor's formal notice arrived by messenger on a Thursday, delivered to Blackwood Ranch with the official seal and the particular bureaucratic weight of something that has been turned into a process. Gideon read it at the kitchen table. The language was careful and neutral, but the core of it was simple. A territorial hearing would be held to formally determine the identity of the woman currently residing at Blackwood Ranch. Both parties, meaning Gideon and Silas Crowder's legal representative, would have the opportunity to present evidence. Witnesses could be called. If identity could not be established, the woman would be placed under temporary territorial guardianship. Gideon set the paper down. Shaw was leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms folded and his expression doing what Shaw's expression usually did when he was calculating something ugly and didn't want to say it yet. He's not going to make this easy, Shaw said. He's never made anything easy, Gideon said. This is different. He's been waiting to knock you off your perch since before Evelyn disappeared, and now he's got something that looks like leverage and an audience that's already half convinced you've lost your mind. Shaw paused. You need to be ready for him to do things in that room that are going to make you want to do things you'll regret. I know. I'm not sure you do. Gideon looked at him. Shaw uncrossed his arms. He picked up his hat from the counter and turned it in his hands. I've worked for you for 11 years, Gideon. I was here when Evelyn was here. I was here the night of the flood. I was here every day of the 8 years after. He stopped. I know what you looked like during those 8 years, and I know what you look like now. And I'm not saying that because I think it changes anything practical. I'm saying it because I want you to know I'm going to be in that room with you, whatever happens. Gideon looked at his foreman for a moment. Then he nodded once, which was the Gideon Blackwood version of saying something he couldn't put into words. They told her about the hearing that evening. She was on the porch swing, the one that squeaked on the right side, a blanket over her legs, and the cloth rabbit in her lap. Tobias was sitting on the porch steps below her, doing nothing in particular with a piece of rope that he was tying and untying without purpose, the way children occupy their hands when their minds are somewhere else. She listened to Gideon explain the hearing. She asked 2 questions, how long they had, and whether she would be allowed to speak. 3 weeks, Gideon said. And yes, you'll be allowed to speak. She nodded and looked out at the paddock. Are you frightened? Tobias asked her, without looking up from the rope. She considered it honestly. Yes, she said, but not of losing, more of standing up there and trying to explain something that doesn't have clean edges. Memory isn't clean, and people want things to be clean. They'll believe you, Tobias said, with the confident simplicity of a child whose faith has not yet been fully educated in how often faith loses. She reached down and put her hand on his shoulder. He went still under it, the way a person goes still when they receive something they've been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. She didn't say anything, neither did he. The porch swing creaked on the right side. Gideon stood in the doorway and watched the 2 of them in the last of the October light, his son and the woman who knew the song and the rabbit and the horse and the curtains and the swing, and he pressed his knuckles quietly against the doorframe and breathed through the tightness in his chest. 3 weeks. He had kept this ranch running through drought and market crashes and a grief that had nearly killed him quietly from the inside. 3 weeks was nothing. But 3 weeks with Silas Crowder determined to take everything apart was a different kind of test. The kind that didn't care how long you'd survived other things, because it had its own rules and its own weapons, and it was already in motion. That night, she remembered something new. She didn't go to Gideon with it immediately. She sat with it for an hour in the dark of the guest room, turning it over, making sure it was real, and not her mind giving her what she wanted. It was real. She could feel it the same way she could feel the shape of the rabbit's uneven ear under her fingers. From the inside, with a certainty that didn't need explanation because it wasn't a thought. It was a fact that had always been lodged in her regardless of everything else that was missing. She had ridden into the storm. She hadn't been fleeing something. She had been going to something. She had been going to Gideon. She had known something that morning, something she was bursting to tell him, and the storm had come in faster than anyone predicted. And she had made a decision that in ordinary weather would have been perfectly safe, a route she'd ridden 100 times, and the water had come up from nowhere, the way flash floods come, without negotiation or warning. She couldn't remember what the news was. It was the strangest kind of grief, knowing that you knew something, feeling the importance of it like a stone in your chest, and being unable to turn it over and see what it was. She sat in the dark and tried. And then she stopped trying because forcing it had never worked, and she had learned that much at least. She lay down with the rabbit under her hand and she waited, and just before she finally slept, it surfaced. Not in words, in a feeling. In the particular private joy of something known only to herself, something that had not yet been shared, something she had been carrying for 3 weeks before the storm, turning it over in private, planning the moment when she would tell him. She had been expecting a child. She lay in the dark room of Blackwood Ranch and understood suddenly why she had ridden into the storm to find him. Not out of recklessness, out of the inability to hold something that enormous alone for one more day. And then the flood had taken her before she could tell him. 8 years. He had never known. She held that knowledge in the dark room and felt the full weight of what the river had actually cost them. Not just years, not just her presence, not just the childhood Tobias had spent without a mother, but this. A secret that had been rushing toward Gideon Blackwood and been stopped by 50,000 gallons of water and 8 years of silence. She cried for the first time since she had come to Blackwood Ranch. Not loud. Quietly, the way people cry when they've learned to do it without anyone hearing. The kind of crying that is less grief than release. The slow unsealing of something that has been closed too long. Outside her window, the territory was dark and wide and indifferent. The same land it had always been, the land that had nearly swallowed her and failed. In 3 weeks, she would stand in front of a judge and a room full of people who had already decided what to think of her, and she would try to explain why she was certain of something that couldn't be proven cleanly. She didn't know yet that the thing she had just remembered, the secret she had been carrying to Gideon on the morning the flood came, would be the thing that changed everything. She didn't know yet that it was the one piece of information that no imposter could have known, because no imposter could have invented something that had never been spoken aloud to a single living soul. She only knew that it was real, and that it was hers, and that, after 8 years of being nobody in particular, she was starting to remember what it felt like to be someone specific. She was starting to remember what it felt like to be Evelyn. She told him the next morning. Not at breakfast. She waited until Tobias had gone out to the barn with Shaw, until Dot had disappeared into the back of the house with laundry, until the kitchen was just the two of them and the remains of the coffee and the particular October light that came through the east window at that hour, thin and pale and honest. She set the cloth rabbit on the table between them. Gideon looked at it, then at her. "I remembered something last night," she said. "Something I need to tell you before the hearing. Because if I tell it in that room first, without telling you, that's not right. That's not how it should be." He waited. His coffee cup was in his hand and he had stopped lifting it midway and just held it there, suspended. "I was writing to find you the morning of the flood," she said. "I know I've told you that much, that I was riding toward the ranch rather than away from it, but I didn't tell you why." She looked at her hands. "I didn't remember why until last night." "All right," he said. "I was expecting a child." The coffee cup went down onto the table. I didn't set it down deliberately. It went down because his hand stopped working the way it had been working. "You were—" He stopped. "3 weeks along, maybe 4. I wasn't certain yet of the exact count." She looked at him steadily, because she had made a decision in the night to say this plainly, without softening it for her own comfort or his. "I had been carrying it alone for weeks. I kept thinking, I need to tell him. I need to tell him today, and then something would happen and I'd think, tomorrow. One more day." She exhaled. "And then I woke up that morning and I couldn't wait anymore. So I rode." Gideon was very still. The light came through the east window. "Nobody knew," she said. "I hadn't told anyone. Not Dot, not Margaret Holt, not my own. I hadn't told a living person. It was only mine until I could make it ours." She pressed her hand flat on the table, a gesture without destination, just the need to press something solid. "If I were an imposter, I couldn't have known that. There is no version of a woman pretending to be Evelyn Blackwood who could have known that because Evelyn Blackwood never told it to anyone. She was writing to tell you when the flood came." Gideon's jaw was working. He looked at the table. He looked at the rabbit. He looked at her. "What happened?" he said. Was there a—" "No," she said quickly, understanding the question. "No. The flood took that too." She said it without drama, matter of fact, because she had cried about it last night, and she was not going to cry about it here and now. There would be time for that later, when things were settled, when she knew what solid ground looked like. It was very early, the kind of loss that leaves no mark anyone else can see. He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, one hand on the sill, and she watched his shoulders and understood that she had just handed him something that was simultaneously a gift and a new kind of grief. The grief of learning what you lost that you hadn't even known you were losing. 8 years, he said, to the window. "Yes. You carried that alone for 8 years. I didn't know I was carrying it. I didn't remember." She paused. "But somewhere underneath everything, yes. I think I was." He turned around. His face was not composed. He had stopped trying to make it composed, which she understood was costing him something significant, because composed was how Gideon Blackwood navigated the world. It was his primary defense against a territory that had taken almost everything he'd allowed himself to love. "Do you want me to use it?" she said. "At the hearing, that's your decision too. It's not only mine." "It's yours," he said. "It involves you. It's still yours." He came back to the table. He didn't sit down. He stood on the other side of it and looked at her with the direct, undefended look of a man who has run out of the energy required to look at things sideways. "You decide how you use your own memory, your own truth. I don't get a vote on that." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" I'm not sure. Someone who would try to manage this. To manage me. She shook her head slightly. You keep handing things back. They're not mine to keep, he said. Outside, they could hear Tobias saying something to Shaw in the barn, some 9-year-old complaint about the weight of a feed sack, and Shaw's dry response, and then Tobias laughing at something. The ordinary sounds of a morning at a working ranch, domestically improbable and entirely real. Gideon looked toward the sound. He's going to need to know, he said, about what you told me. Eventually. Not yet, she said. No, not yet. He picked up his coffee cup, set it back down without drinking from it. Evelyn used to do that, he said. Wait until the right moment for a thing. Drive me half to madness with the timing of it. He stopped. I was not always patient about it. Were you ever? He almost smiled. No. She watched him. Tell me something about her, she said. About Evelyn. Something small. Something that wasn't the big things. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, she talked to horses like they were people, not in a performing way, like she was actually having a conversation and expected an answer. The bay mare would pin her ears, and Evelyn would say, I know, but you're still doing it, and then the horse would do it. He paused. I thought it was ridiculous the first time I saw it. Then it worked so often I stopped thinking it was ridiculous. She was quiet. She burned toast consistently, he said, for 6 years, every single time. She knew she burned it. She would stand there and say, just one more minute, and then it would be burned, and she would eat it anyway and refuse to admit it was burned. He stopped himself. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm... No, she said. Keep going. He looked at her. Keep going, she said again, and her voice was steady, but her eyes were not entirely dry. I want to hear it, even if I can't confirm it, even if I can only listen. She pressed her hands flat on the table again. Tell me who I was, please. He sat down then, and for the first time since she had come to Blackwood Ranch, for the first time in what was probably 8 years, Gideon Blackwood talked about Evelyn without stopping himself. It took a long time. The coffee went completely cold. The light through the east window moved and changed and eventually became the middle of morning light that had no particular quality except that it was full and present. He told her about the burned toast and the horse conversations and the way she reorganized things without telling him and the way she sang slightly off-key and knew it and did it anyway. He told her about the curtains she had chosen and the argument they'd had about the porch swing, whether to fix the squeak or leave it, a genuinely fierce domestic disagreement that had lasted 3 weeks and ended with her saying the squeak was her favorite sound on the property. He told her about the morning she had ridden out in a rainstorm to pull a calf that the ranch hand hadn't gotten to in time, and come back soaked and furious and triumphant and gone directly to the kitchen for hot coffee without stopping to change her clothes. He talked, she listened, and once, in the middle of it, she said very quietly, "The curtain's bunched on the left. You never fixed the rod." He stopped. "I can see them," she said. "When you talk, I can see them." The two of them sat in the kitchen with the cold coffee and the cloth rabbit between them, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that has weight and history and things in it that haven't been named yet, and that's the only honest way to describe it. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the strangest weeks Gideon Blackwood had spent since the weeks immediately after the flood. Not because they were empty, but because they were too full, overfull, every day containing more than a day should reasonably hold. She worked. That was the thing that surprised people most when they heard about it afterward. Not the identity question, not the hearing, but the fact that she worked. She was in the barn by 7 most mornings. She started cautiously, watching Shaw first, asking questions that revealed both unfamiliarity with current procedures and a deep underlying knowledge of horses that couldn't be faked or learned in 3 weeks. Shaw watched her with a bay colt for 20 minutes one morning and came inside and said to Gideon very quietly, "She handles him like Evelyn handled the bay mare. Same pressure, same release, same timing." He said it the way a man reports a fact he'd rather not be responsible for interpreting. Her hands remembered things her mind had not yet recovered. She reached for tools in the right places before she'd been shown where they were. She corrected a young ranch hand's approach to a spooked horse using specific language, a particular phrase about where to stand and how to breathe, that Gideon recognized from a conversation he'd had with Evelyn about exactly that subject on an afternoon 11 years ago, standing at almost exactly the same spot in the same barn. He did not mention that to her. He filed it away with all the other things that were accumulating in him, a slow stack of evidence that he was simultaneously desperate to count and afraid to count on. Tobias, for his part, had made his own private peace with the situation, which was less complicated than the adult version, because children in his particular position sometimes have the mercy of a simpler arithmetic. He did not pepper her with questions. He did not demand that she confirm or deny. He simply moved into the space of her presence the way he moved into other things he had decided to trust. Not dramatically, but steadily, with the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided and was not revisiting it. He asked her once if she remembered him as a baby. She sat with the question carefully, the way she sat with all the careful questions. "I remember a weight," she said finally, "a very small weight against my chest, and a smell." She paused. "Babies all smell slightly different, you know. People don't talk about that. But they do." She looked at him. "I can't tell you if the weight I remember is you specifically. I can't prove it. But when you came and sat beside me that first night at the kitchen table, when you pushed the biscuits toward me, I felt something very old and very certain." She stopped. "Does that help or does it make it worse?" Tobias thought about it. "Both," he said honestly. "Yeah," she said. "That's about where I am too." The difficulty with being honest children is that they frequently are. Margaret Holt came to Blackwood Ranch on the 9th day. She arrived without announcement, a small, upright woman of 70-something who had been sewing in Red Mesa Crossing for so long that she was essentially part of the landscape. And when Dot opened the door, Margaret said simply, "I need to see her." Dot got Gideon. Gideon said, "Margaret." "I fitted her for her wedding dress," Margaret said, in the voice of someone who has prepared what they need to say and is going to say it without detour. "I know that body's measurements. I know that posture. And I know those hands." Evelyn Blackwood had a seamstress's hands, strong in the fingers, calloused on the right thumb from the way she held a needle, even though she wasn't a seamstress. "I want 5 minutes." Gideon stepped back. Margaret walked in. She found the woman in the kitchen, where everyone always seemed to find her, the kitchen having established itself as the room where the real things happened in this house. And she stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. The woman looked back at her. "Do you know me?" Margaret said. Something moved behind the woman's eyes. "Your face is... There's something about your face." She shook her head slightly. "I'm sorry. I can't place it." "I made your wedding dress," Margaret said. "Ivory silk. Took 3 fittings to get the shoulders right because you kept standing differently between appointments." She crossed the kitchen without waiting for an invitation and stood in front of the woman, looking at her face, her hands, the way she was sitting. "Hold out your right hand." The woman held it out. Margaret looked at the right thumb. She looked for a long time. The callousing was there. Seamstress style, right thumb, inner edge. Margaret Holt sat down across from her without being invited, which was the only undignified thing Gideon had ever seen her do. And she said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then she said, "You came to me the week before the flood. You were making a baby blanket, and the binding kept puckering. You were frustrated enough that you said a word I won't repeat in present company. I told you to ease the tension on the feed. You said you knew that, you'd just forgotten." She stopped. "You always said things like that. I know, I just forgot. Even when it was something you clearly didn't know." The woman's breathing had changed. "The blanket," she said. "It was yellow." Margaret went very still. "Yellow cotton, with a white binding that kept pulling." She pressed her hand against her collarbone. "I couldn't get the corners to lie flat." "Yellow," Margaret said, very quietly. "Yes." Nobody had known about the yellow baby blanket. Gideon certainly hadn't known. He hadn't been told about any blanket, or about any of the preparations that had apparently been quietly underway in those weeks before the flood. Margaret Holt had known, because Evelyn had come to her shop. And now this woman in the kitchen of Blackwood Ranch had named the color without being led to it. Margaret Holt put her hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at them for a moment. Then she looked up at Gideon, who was standing in the doorway. "I'll testify," she said, "at the hearing, whatever you need from me. I'll be there." She left shortly after, and the kitchen was quiet again, and the woman sat at the table with her hand still pressed against her chest, and the cloth rabbit in her lap, and a look on her face that was not quite joy and not quite grief, but something that partook of both. The expression of someone who is being slowly, painfully reassembled from pieces they didn't know were missing. "Yellow," she said, quietly, to herself. "Yellow," Gideon confirmed. She looked at him. "I was making it for—" "I know," he said. She nodded, looked down, said nothing else. The hearing arrived on a cold Thursday morning with a sky the color of old pewter pressing down over Red Mesa Crossing. The territorial courthouse was the largest room in town, which in a small frontier town meant that it held perhaps 80 people uncomfortably and 120 if nobody cared about comfort. And on that Thursday morning, nobody cared about comfort. People had come from outlying ranches and farms, from neighboring communities, some of them because they had known Evelyn Blackwood, and some of them because they hadn't. But Silas Crowder had made sure the story circulated far enough to draw a crowd. Crowder understood audiences. He always had. She wore the cleanest dress Dot had been able to find and alter in 3 weeks. She wore her hair back, which changed the shape of her face in a way that made several people in the room intake breath slightly when she walked in. She carried the cloth rabbit. Gideon had suggested gently that perhaps the rabbit was not necessary for the hearing, and she had looked at him in a way that ended that particular suggestion. Tobias was not there. Gideon had made that decision, not without argument from Tobias, who had his father's stubbornness and his mother's opinion about being told what to do. But Gideon had held firm. The boy was 9 years old, and what was going to happen in that room was going to be ugly in places, and Tobias did not need to witness someone methodically trying to dismantle his mother's identity in front of a crowd. Shaw sat in the second row. Margaret Holt sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her chin at the particular angle that made for a fight. Behind them were the Delaney brothers, and 3 ranch families who had known the Blackwoods before the flood, and Dr. Fitch from the regional office, who had come not as a witness but apparently out of professional interest, which Gideon chose to read as a good sign. Silas Crowder sat at the opposing table with his lawyer, a man from the territorial capital named Bates, who had a soft voice and extremely hard eyes, and who had made a career out of winning cases through incremental destruction, not dramatic arguments, but patient, piece-by-piece dismantling, the legal equivalent of erosion. Crowder himself looked, as he always looked, like a man at leisure, well-dressed, unhurried, almost friendly. He nodded at Gideon across the room. Gideon did not nod back. Judge Pryor called the proceedings to order with the particular weary authority of a man who would rather be somewhere else but is going to do his job. Bates went first. He was, as advertised, patient. He didn't attack. He built a structure carefully, question by question, that was designed to look reasonable while doing significant damage. He established that no formal identification had been made. He established that the woman had no documentation, no verifiable records, no official history prior to her appearance in Red Mesa 2 weeks before Gideon found her. He called a witness, a physician from a town 3 territories over, who testified about the susceptibility of severely traumatized individuals to suggestion, who described how a vulnerable person, starved and exhausted and mentally fragile, might unconsciously absorb and reflect back information fed to them by someone they depended on for food and shelter. He never said Gideon had coached her. He didn't need to. He just described the mechanism clearly enough that the crowd could do the math themselves. Gideon's jaw tightened with each question. Shaw watched him from the second row with the focused attention of someone holding a horse that wants to bolt. At one point, Bates produced a map showing the flood path and argued that the river's geography made survival impossible, that the sheer velocity of water through that particular canyon on that particular night was not survivable, and that the absence of any confirmed sighting of Evelyn Blackwood for 8 years was itself a form of evidence. "She was never found," Bates said to the room, "in 8 years, not by anyone." Crowder sat at his table and looked sad about it. Gideon's lawyer, a younger man named Rhett, who was competent and smart and slightly terrified of the room he was in, called Margaret Holt first. Margaret was not terrified of anything. She described the wedding dress in detail. She described Evelyn's measurements, her posture, her hands, the particular callousing of the right thumb. She described the visit to the seamstress shop the week before the flood. She described the yellow baby blanket and the puckering binding and the word Evelyn had said that she still declined to repeat in present company, but she said it with a ghost of a smile that made 3 people in the gallery smile back. Bates cross-examined her. "Mrs. Holt," he said in his patient, soft voice, "is it possible that a woman who had done research on Evelyn Blackwood, who had learned the details of her life from people who knew her, could reproduce these details in conversation?" "I told her the color of the blanket," Margaret said. "I didn't. I asked if she knew it. Someone else might have." "I was watching her face," Margaret said. "I've been watching faces for 50 years. I know the difference between someone recalling something and someone performing something. She recalled it." Bates let it go. He was too experienced to press a 70-something woman with 50 years of watching faces when the gallery was watching back. The Delaney brothers testified. 2 of Gideon's ranch neighbors testified. Dr. Fitch was called and gave his measured clinical account, which was not a verdict but which treated her as a person with severe traumatic amnesia rather than a fraud, and that distinction mattered. And then Rhett said, "I'd like to call the respondent to testify." The room settled into a different quality of silence. She walked to the front. She sat in the chair beside Judge Pryor's bench with the cloth rabbit in her hands and her back straight. She looked at the room, at the 80-some people sitting in it, some of them strangers, some of them faces that tugged at something she couldn't quite name, some of them people she recognized from the market and the street and the preceding weeks. She looked at Silas Crowder. He looked back at her with the practiced expression of a man who feels nothing he didn't decide to feel, and she understood, clearly and without drama, that this was a man who had done the calculation and determined that her uncertainty was useful to him. She looked away from Crowder. Rhett led her through the identifications, the curtains, the horse, the swing, the rabbit. She answered each one plainly. No embellishment, no drama, just the thing she knew and how she knew it. She watched the gallery while she spoke, and some faces were softening and some were still closed, and she accepted that reality without trying to perform for either of them. Bates cross-examined her in the patient, erosive way he did everything. "You have no documents," he said. "No. You have no official record of your existence prior to appearing in Red Mesa Crossing. Not that I know of. You have significant gaps in your memory covering years." "Yes." "And you ask this court to accept, on the basis of your testimony alone, that you are a woman who has been dead, in the eyes of this community, for 8 years. She looked at him. "I don't ask this court to accept anything on the basis of my testimony alone. I ask them to consider what I know and how I know it, alongside what everyone else has said, and determine what makes the most sense." "What makes the most sense," Bates said lightly, "might well be that you're a very capable woman who did her research. Or," she said, "it might be that I'm a woman who rode into a flood to tell her husband she was expecting his child, and the flood took 8 years from her, and she sat behind a mercantile in borrowed clothes with a tin cup in the dirt until her son walked past and recognized his mother's lullaby." The room was very quiet. Bates paused, recalibrated. "And yet you cannot remember the years between the flood and Red Mesa Crossing." "Not fully, no." "How convenient." She looked at him steadily. "If I were manufacturing an identity," she said, "I would have a complete story. Every detail accounted for, every year mapped, no gaps. The gaps are the part I can't invent. What I can't remember is the period when something had taken everything from me." She stopped. "A person who is lying fills the spaces in. I can't fill what I genuinely don't have." Something in the gallery shifted. Gideon could feel it. Not see it, but feel it. The particular change of pressure in a room when a group of people begins to move. Rhett stood up. "Your Honor, there is one additional piece of testimony the respondent wishes to give." Pryor looked at Rhett, then at Bates, who had no grounds to object. "Proceed." She turned slightly in the chair. She was looking at Gideon now, not at the gallery, not at the judge. Looking at him the way she had looked at him in the kitchen that morning, with the old cold coffee between them. "On the morning of the flood," she said, "I rode out to find my husband. I had been trying to find the right moment to tell him something for 3 weeks. When I couldn't wait anymore, I rode." She paused. "I was expecting a child. I had not told anyone. Not Dot, not Margaret Holt, no one. It was private. I was carrying it alone until I could bring it to him." She paused again, and her voice, which had been steady, developed a crack she didn't perform, just couldn't stop. The flood took that too, the child, and the 8 years, and the moment I had been riding toward. The room was absolutely still. She looked at Gideon. He had his hand pressed flat on the table in front of him, and he was looking back at her, and he was not doing anything to manage his face. "I have spent 3 weeks trying to remember who I am," she said, to the room now, to all of them. "And what I know, what I can tell you with certainty, is that I know the rabbit and the curtains and the horse and the swing and the toast that was always burned and the lullaby and the yellow blanket. I know these things from inside, not from outside. And I know the child nobody else knew about." She straightened. "A woman pretending to be someone cannot know the secret that woman was riding through a flood to deliver. I was Evelyn Blackwood on the morning the river took me. Whatever it took from me afterward, it did not take that." The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the gallery broke open, not into chaos, into sound. Multiple conversations erupting at once, people leaning toward each other, some people crying, which Gideon noticed in a distant, almost detached way from the front of the room. Pryor was calling for order. Bates was sitting very still with the expression of a man whose strategy has just developed a significant hole. Crowder, for the first time that morning, was not looking composed. He was looking at the woman, at Evelyn, and his face had shifted into something between contempt and a calculation being rapidly redone. She looked back at him. She didn't look away. It took Pryor 6 minutes to restore order. Bates called one rebuttal witness. The witness said things. Nobody in the gallery was listening the way they had been listening before. Pryor called a recess. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Gideon found her standing near the window with the rabbit in both hands and her eyes closed. He stood beside her. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. Shaw was somewhere behind them, giving them distance that was not entirely necessary, but was the kind of decent human instinct that made Coulter Shaw worth a decade of his wages. "You all right?" Gideon said finally. "No," she said, without opening her eyes. "But I'll be all right." "Different things," he said. "Yes," she said. "Different things." She opened her eyes. She looked at him. "Whatever Pryor decides today," she said, "I know what's true. I've known it since I heard your son humming my song, and I couldn't explain how I knew it was mine." She turned the rabbit over in her hands. "I can live with uncertainty about the paperwork. I can't unknow what I know." "Pryor's going to rule in our favor," Gideon said. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But I know what that room felt like after you spoke. And I know what a room feels like when it's already decided something, even before the judge says so." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been in a lot of courtrooms?" "Enough." "You look like you have." He almost said something, then he said something else. "I'm sorry. For the years. For stopping the search when I did." She looked at him steadily. "You had a baby to raise." "I know. And you didn't know there was anything left to find." "I know that too." He pressed his hands into his coat pockets. "I'm still sorry." She was quiet for a moment. "So am I," she said. "For all of it. For riding out that morning without checking the weather. For not telling you sooner about the child. For all the weeks I kept saying tomorrow." She stopped. "If I had told you sooner, I might not have needed to ride out at all. Or the storm would have taken you anyway," he said. "Different road." "Maybe." They stood at the window together in the hallway of the Red Mesa Crossing courthouse, and neither of them looked at each other, both looking at the pewter sky outside, and the distance between them had the quality of something in the process of changing, not changed yet, not ready to be named, but unmistakably moving. Pryor's verdict came 40 minutes after the recess. He read it in the careful, deliberate language of someone who has chosen every word and is standing behind each one. He acknowledged the unusual nature of the case. He acknowledged the evidentiary challenges. He noted the testimony of multiple witnesses and the absence of any credible motive for fraud. He noted that the respondent had voluntarily disclosed information, specifically a pregnancy that had not been shared with any other living person, that could not have been available to an imposter through research or social engineering. He looked up from the paper. "It is the finding of this court," he said, that the woman currently residing at Blackwood Ranch is, to the best of this court's ability to determine, Evelyn Blackwood, wife of Gideon Blackwood, of Red Mesa Crossing. He said a few more things. Gideon did not hear them. He heard the room. He heard Shaw somewhere behind him say something very short under his breath that, for once, Dot was not there to object to. He heard Margaret Holt make a sound that she would have described afterward as simply clearing her throat. He looked at Evelyn. She was holding the cloth rabbit against her chest with both arms, the way she had held it in the dirt behind the mercantile, but her face was completely different from that face. Her eyes were wet and her chin was up, and she was not the woman in the dirt. She was not performing composure. She was doing the harder thing, which was actually feeling something enormous and not fleeing from it. She looked at him. He crossed the 3 feet between them and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with the sweeping gesture of a man in a story. Just a man who had been standing 3 feet away from his wife for 3 weeks and had been careful about the distance and had just been given permission to close it. Her fingers closed around his. Across the room, Silas Crowder stood and gathered his coat and said something low to Bates, whose expression suggested it was not a compliment to the court. Crowder walked out without looking at Gideon and without looking at Evelyn, which was its own kind of answer about what kind of man he was. The kind who does not acknowledge what he has lost, only calculates what comes next. What came next for Crowder was a community that had just watched him try to take a woman's identity away in public, and had watched that community push back, and that was a different kind of political problem than the one he'd arrived with. He would reckon with that in his own time. Gideon had no interest in it. He had Evelyn's hand. He had 3 weeks of watching her remember herself piece by piece in the kitchen and the barn and on the porch swing with their son. He had the weight of 8 years on one side of a scale and the weight of everything that was still possible on the other. They walked out of the courthouse into the pewter October afternoon, and the cold air hit them, and the few people standing on the steps parted to let them through. And 2 of them, older women who had known Evelyn before, reached out to touch her arm as she passed, just briefly, a greeting that was also a reclamation, a welcome that understood what it was welcoming back. She squeezed Gideon's hand. He didn't say anything. Some things he had learned in 8 years of silence were better held than spoken. They had a long way still to go. The memories would come back unevenly, the way they had been coming, in fragments, in the night, with the sudden violence of things breaking through walls. There would be mornings when she woke up and didn't know where she was. There would be moments when she reached for something in her past and found only the silhouette of it. There would be grief for what the flood had taken that no court verdict could address. But there would also be the barn and the gray gelding and the porch swing that squeaked on the right side. There would be Tobias with his rope and his questions and his specific 9-year-old version of love, which was less complicated than the adult version and possibly more honest. There would be the kitchen table with 3 place settings and coffee that sometimes went cold. There would be time. They had improbably and at considerable cost arrived at time. And Evelyn Blackwood, her name back, her hand in her husband's, her cloth rabbit pressed against her chest in the cold October air, walked down the steps of the courthouse and turned her face toward the road that led back to Blackwood Ranch and kept walking. They drove back to Blackwood Ranch in the wagon with the cold afternoon light falling sideways across the scrubland, and nobody said much. Shaw handled the reins. Gideon sat beside Evelyn in the back, not close enough to touch, but close enough that the distance was a choice rather than a default, which was different from how things had been for 3 weeks. She held the cloth rabbit in her lap and watched the land go past with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not happiness exactly, something more complicated than happiness. The expression of a person who has won something significant and is still taking inventory of what the winning cost. Tobias was waiting on the porch steps when the wagon came through the gate. He stood up the moment he saw them. He looked at his father's face first, then at Evelyn's, reading both the way he read everything, quickly, seriously, without the performance of not caring. Then he came down the steps and walked to the wagon before it had fully stopped, which Shaw would normally have said something about, but Shaw said nothing. "Well," Tobias said. "Well," Gideon said. Tobias looked at Evelyn. She said, "The judge agreed with us." He nodded, once. Then he reached up and took the cloth rabbit from her hands with the matter-of-fact decisiveness of someone completing a transaction that has been pending for a while. "I'll put this inside," he said. "Dot made supper." He walked back up the porch steps and through the front door, and they heard his footsteps going down the hall toward the kitchen. And that was how Tobias Blackwood processed the return of his mother's legal identity, by taking her rabbit inside and telling her supper was ready, which was perhaps the most 9-year-old thing a 9-year-old had ever done, and which made Evelyn press her lips together very hard for a moment before she climbed down from the wagon. Dot had made a proper supper. Not a celebration supper exactly, because Dot was a practical woman who understood that the situation was too large and too complicated for a celebration to sit comfortably on top of it, but a supper that was better than a usual supper, which was its own form of acknowledgement. There was a roasted chicken and proper bread and the good preserves that normally only came out for company, and 4 plates on the table instead of 3, because Shaw had apparently been included, which he accepted without comment by sitting down and passing the bread. They ate mostly in silence at first, the comfortable and uncomfortable kind simultaneously. The silence of people who have been through something together and are still inside it, not yet at the distance required to talk about it. Tobias said, "Nathan Pryor's going to feel stupid." "Don't," Gideon said. "I'm just saying, I know what you're saying, don't." Tobias ate his chicken. Then he said, "Can I go back to school tomorrow?" Evelyn looked at him. "Why wouldn't you?" "Father said maybe I should wait." "I said maybe," Gideon said. "I didn't say definitely." "I want to go back," Tobias said. He looked at the table, then back up. "I want to go back and I want to be normal. That's all I want." He said it with the particular dignity of a child who has been living inside something very large for a very long time and needs ordinary life the way people need air. Evelyn said, "Go back to school." Gideon looked at her. She looked at him. "He should be in school," she said, "whatever else is happening." "I agree," Gideon said. Tobias ate the rest of his supper with something slightly lighter in his face. The night settled over Blackwood Ranch the same way it had been settling for 8 years, which was quietly and without concern for what was happening inside the house beneath it. The stars came out over the scrubland, and the horses moved in the paddock, and the porch swing sat empty with its creak held in potential, and Gideon stood on the porch after supper with a cup of coffee he didn't particularly want, and looked at the dark in the direction he had once searched for, 8 weeks before accepting what he'd been told was an impossible survival. He had been wrong to accept it. He had also been a man with a 9-month-old son and a ranch falling apart from grief, and a community of voices saying, "She's gone, Gideon. Let her go," which was not malicious, just the accumulated weight of common sense and human experience with floods and time and the mathematics of survival. He had been wrong anyway. The door opened behind him. He didn't turn around. Evelyn came and stood at the railing a few feet to his left. She had a blanket around her shoulders. She looked out at the same dark he was looking at and didn't say anything for a while. "Tomorrow's going to be harder than today," she said finally. He looked at her. "Today there was a verdict," she said. "A thing to do, a thing to win or lose. Tomorrow it's just living, and I don't know how to do that yet. Not here. Not with all of it." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I remember this ranch. I remember you. In pieces. In the way things come back. But I don't remember being married. I don't remember what it felt like to be here as a person who belonged here, rather than a person trying to prove she belongs here." He thought about that. "That's fair," he said. "I'm not asking you to solve it. I know. I'm just saying don't expect me to know how to be Evelyn Blackwood tomorrow. I'm working on it." She paused. "I was working on it before the hearing. I'll keep working on it, but it's going to be uneven." "Most worthwhile things are," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The porch swing was to her left, and she looked at it without sitting in it. "What was I like?" she said. "When things were hard. When we fought. Or when the ranch had a bad season. Or when... What was I actually like? Not the good parts." He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Stubborn in a way that could make me lose my mind," he said. "You would decide something was a certain way, and you would hold that position past the point of all reason, past evidence, past anything I could say. And sometimes you were right, and sometimes you were absolutely wrong, and you could not always tell the difference." "And you could?" "No," he said, "but I thought I could, which made it worse." She almost smiled. "You went quiet when you were really hurt," he said. "Not loud. The loud was just frustration. The quiet was the thing that meant something actually mattered." He paused. "I learned that too late and too slowly." She turned and looked at him. I went quiet, she repeated. Yes, I'm quiet now. I know, he said. I noticed. They stood on the porch for another few minutes in that new, shifting silence, and then she went inside, and he stayed a while longer with the cold coffee and the dark, and the complicated calculus of what came next, which he couldn't solve tonight and knew better than to try. The weeks that followed the hearing were not the peaceful reconstruction that people who had not been through such things might imagine. They were not peaceful at all. They were difficult in the specific, unpredictable way that recovery from something large tends to be difficult, not in a straight line, not in an order that made sense, with setbacks that arrived without warning and progress that didn't always look like progress from the inside. Evelyn woke up screaming twice in the first week. Not loud, still the old quiet habit of a woman who had spent years not being allowed to make noise. But the sound reached Gideon in his room down the hall both times, and both times he stood in her doorway and said her name until she came back to herself, sitting up in the bed with the rabbit in both hands, and her hair everywhere and her face doing the thing it did when she was trying to reassemble where and when she was. The first time he asked if she wanted him to stay. She said, "No, go back to sleep." He went back to his room and did not sleep. The second time she didn't say anything immediately. She sat with the rabbit and breathed until the shaking stopped. And then she said, "I keep seeing a room, dark walls, low ceiling, a window that was painted shut." She looked at him in the doorway. "I don't know whose room that is." "Do you want to tell me more about it?" "Not yet." She lay back down, the rabbit against her chest. "Leave the door open." He left the door open. He went back to his room and didn't sleep. The memories she was recovering from whatever dark room her mind kept returning to were not the memories of Blackwood Ranch. Those were coming back too, steadily. In the patient, piecemeal way they had been coming since the kitchen and the first morning and the gray gelding at the fence. But underneath them, behind them, there was another layer. Something that predated her reappearance. Something from the years between the flood and the mercantile. The years that were still mostly a wall rather than a window. She didn't push it. She had learned, in the slow discipline of someone who has had to learn things about her own mind the hard way, that pushing it closed the door instead of opening it. She did her work in the barn, and she sat with Tobias in the evenings, and she and Gideon ate breakfast with their coffee going cold and their conversations going places that neither of them fully planned, and she let the dark room stay where it was and waited. It came on a night in November when the wind was sharp and the house was cold at its edges despite the fire, and she had gone to bed early because she was tired in the deep way she got sometimes, tired past ordinary tiredness into something cellular. She went to sleep with the rabbit, and she went down into it faster than usual, which should have been a relief and instead was not. The dream was different from the others. It had sequence. It had the internal logic of a real memory rather than a fragment. Not a snapshot, but a motion, a long continuous motion, like a film reel that had been stored somewhere and was finally being run. She was downstream, she was in the water, and then she was out of it, on a bank she didn't recognize, face down in the silt, coughing. It was dark. She didn't know what her name was. She knew she was cold, and she knew she was injured, and she knew she had been in the water for a long time, but everything beyond those facts was simply gone. A clean erasure, like a chalkboard wiped. A man came. She felt him before she saw him. The sound of boots on wet rock, a lantern swinging. He crouched beside her. In the dream, she turned her head to look at him, and she saw a face that she had never allowed herself to see clearly before. Not in any of the fragments, not in any of the other returns. A face she had kept blurred and peripheral, the way the mind sometimes protects itself from what it knows will hurt. She saw it now. An older man. Weathered. A trapper's face, the face of a man who spent months in isolation without discomfort. Eyes that were light-colored and watchful, and not particularly warm even in the moment of apparent rescue. "Easy now," the man said. "You're all right. I've got you." She had believed him. That was what the dream showed her, herself believing him, because she had nothing else and he was there. And when you are lying face down in the silt in the dark with no name and the whole world washed clean, you believe whoever comes. She woke up with the cold sweat that meant a real memory rather than a constructed nightmare, and she lay there in the November dark of Blackwood Ranch and understood something that changed the shape of everything she had been carrying. She knew who had found her. Not a name? Not yet. but a face and a voice and the specific quality of his presence, the weight of it, the way he had stood between her and everything else until she couldn't see anything else anymore. She also understood, lying there in the dark, that he was not a man who had simply failed to return her to civilization. She understood that now with a clarity that the fragments had never allowed before, because the fragments had been pieces, and this was the whole thing, the long motion, the real finally running. He had kept her, deliberately, knowingly, with a plan that had required her not to know who she was. She lay still for a long time. Then she got up, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and went down the hall to Gideon's door and knocked. He opened it in seconds, which meant he hadn't been sleeping. She told him. She sat in the chair by his window, and she told him everything the dream had shown her. The bank, the lantern, the face. The long sequence of what came after, which was coming back now in connected pieces rather than isolated fragments. Months and then years of a life that hadn't been hers, but had been built around her while she didn't know herself well enough to know it wasn't. She talked for a long time. He sat on the edge of the bed and listened and didn't interrupt her. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you remember a name?" he said. "Not yet." "Anything else about where? A location?" "Mountains," she said. "North. A long way north." She pressed her hands together in her lap. "There was a settlement, small. Other people, not many, and they were also people who didn't ask questions. The kind of place you go when you don't want to be found." She paused. "Or when someone doesn't want you found." Gideon's face was doing the flat, still thing. Shaw would have recognized it immediately as the face that meant Gideon Blackwood had arrived at a decision and was not entertaining alternatives. "Does he know where you are?" Gideon asked. "I don't know." "Did you tell anyone you were leaving? When you left his—" "I don't think so. I left in the night." She looked at her hands. "I was there for a very long time, Gideon, and then something happened. I don't have all of it back yet, but something shifted, something cracked, and I understood that I had been told things that weren't true. About who I was. About whether anyone had ever looked for me." She stopped. "He told me nobody looked. That whatever family I might have had, they hadn't searched. That I was alone before he found me and I would be alone without him." The flat, still face. "He lied to you," Gideon said. "Yes." "For years." "Yes." "About everything." "About the things that would have made me leave," she said. "Which is a particular kind of lying." He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark ranch and breathed through something that he was clearly managing with effort. "Gideon," her voice was careful, "I need you to be calm about this." "I'm calm." "You look the specific way you look when you are not calm and are managing it by being very still." He turned and looked at her. A long pause. "Shaw once said that to me," he said, almost word for word. "Then Shaw is observant." "He is." Gideon came back and sat down. He laced his hands together between his knees, which was what he did when he was physically restraining an impulse. "What do you need from me right now?" "I need you to not do anything yet," she said. "I'm still remembering. It's coming back in pieces, and if I push it, the pieces lock up. I need a few more days, a week maybe, and then I'll have more of the name and the location." "And then?" She looked at him steadily. "And then I want to make sure he can never do it to anyone else," she said. "Whatever that looks like." He held her gaze. "All right. I mean it, Gideon. I'm telling you this because you need to know, not because I need you to fix it. There's a difference." "I know there's a difference." "Do you?" He was quiet for a beat. "I'm working on knowing there's a difference," he said. "Is that better?" She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it had the architecture of one. "A little," she said. She went back to her room. He didn't sleep. The name came 4 days later. She was in the barn, working with the gray gelding on a lead, when it surfaced without warning in the middle of the ordinary motion of the work. The particular way the man had said her borrowed name. A flat two-syllable delivery with the emphasis wrong. The way people say a name they gave you rather than a name you came with. And attached to that sound, without her reaching for it, came the name he went by. Slade. Vernon Slade. She said it out loud just to hear it, and the gray gelding turned his head and looked at her, and she said, "Not you," and the horse went back to walking. She told Gideon that evening. He repeated it twice. Vernon Slade. like he was filing it in a particular place in his mind. I also remembered more of the location, she said. A canyon settlement northeast of the Harrow Range. He called it something, a name I can't quite, Slade's Flat, maybe. Something like that. The kind of name a man gives his own claim when he's the one naming it. Gideon nodded. What are you thinking? She said. I'm thinking that Shaw knows the Harrow Range, he said. He trapped up that way when he was young. Gideon. I'm not going alone, he said. Before you say anything, I'm not going alone, and I'm not going without a plan, and I'm not going to do anything stupid. I wasn't going to say that. You were about to. She pressed her lips together. I was going to say, whatever you do, I want it to be legal. I want it to mean something beyond one man against another. I want it to actually stop him. So do I, he said. She looked at him carefully. Are you sure about that? Because wanting something legal and wanting something that satisfies a different kind of need are not always the same thing. He met her eyes. I know what I want to do to him, he said. And I know what I'm going to do, which is different, which is bring him back here alive and hand him to Pryor with everything it takes to put him away. He paused. That matters more. It'll outlast anything else. She studied him for a moment. You believe that? I'm choosing to believe it, he said, which is the best I can do right now. She accepted that for what it was, which was honest. Shaw's reaction to the plan was characteristically brief. Gideon laid it out over the kitchen table the following morning. What Evelyn had remembered, the name, the location, the settlement in the canyon northeast of the Harrow Range, and Shaw listened without interrupting, and at the end he said, I know the canyon, Slade's Fork they call it. 3, maybe 4 days north if the weather holds. You've been there? I've been near there. It's a place people know not to go. Shaw turned his coffee cup in his hands. What exactly are we bringing back? Evidence of what he did. Any documentation, any witnesses from that settlement. And Slade himself. Alive. Alive. Shaw looked at him for a long moment, doing his own version of Gideon's calculation. The mathematics of what was right against what was satisfying, measured against 11 years of knowing this man and understanding what the cost of certain choices would be. All right, Shaw said. We leave Thursday. Wednesday, Gideon said. Wednesday, then. Evelyn was standing in the doorway. She had been listening without hiding it. I want you to take one of the Delaney brothers, she said, as a third man. Evelyn, 2 men going into a settlement that doesn't want to be found. To take a man who has every reason to resist is not enough, she said. The younger Delaney knows how to handle himself, and he owes you a favor from the land dispute last spring. Take him. Gideon and Shaw looked at each other. She's not wrong, Shaw said. Gideon looked at the ceiling briefly. Fine, he said. Evelyn came to the table and sat down. She put both hands flat on the surface, a gesture that Gideon had come to understand meant she was about to say something she had decided to say, rather than something that came out accidentally. I need you to hear something before you go, she said. Both men waited. Whatever you find up there, whatever the settlement looks like, whatever other people were there, don't let it make you angrier than you can manage, she said. She was looking at Gideon specifically because Shaw was not the one she was worried about. I know what you're going to find. I lived it. And knowing that you know it's going to be hard for you. She paused. I need you to bring him back. Not because I'm asking you to protect him, but because if you don't, none of it counts. All of it disappears. He walks away clean because there's no one to testify and no courthouse to testify in. Gideon was quiet. Bring him back, she said. Let me do the rest. He looked at her for a long time. All right, he said. She nodded. Then she stood up and poured herself more coffee and went to the window and looked out at the paddock, which meant the conversation was done and she was done being in it, which Shaw recognized as efficiently as Gideon did. Shaw got up and took his hat. Tobias overheard the plan at dinner. He said nothing during the meal, but his face went through its full range of 9-year-old expression, management, which was more transparent than he understood it to be. Afterward, when Gideon was checking the horses, Tobias came to the barn and stood in the entrance with his arms crossed. How long? He said. 1.5 weeks, 2 weeks maybe. That's a long time. Yes. Are you going to be safe? Gideon turned from the horse he was checking and looked at his son directly, because Tobias had asked a real question and deserved a real answer rather than the automatic reassurance of a parent buying peace. "I'll be careful," he said. "That's the most honest thing I can tell you." Tobias absorbed this. "What should I do while you're gone?" "Help Dot. Go to school. Look after—" He stopped. "Look after her?" Tobias said. "Keep her company," Gideon corrected. "She doesn't need looking after, but she'll be here alone and it'll be better with you here." Tobias nodded slowly. "I can do that." "I know you can." Tobias turned to go, then turned back. "Father, the man you're going to get, is he bad?" Gideon thought about how to answer that with the specific honesty that Tobias required. "He's a man who took something that wasn't his and kept it when he knew it wasn't his," he said. "That's as bad as it needs to be." Tobias looked at him. "Okay," he said, and went back inside. Gideon stood in the barn with the gray gelding for a few minutes in the quiet. The night before they left, Evelyn came to the barn after supper. She didn't say anything for a while. She stood at the gray's stall and let the horse put his head over the rail and breathe through whatever she was working through. "I want you to know something," she said. Gideon was checking the saddle he'd be using, tightening things that didn't strictly need tightening. "When I was there," she said, "in that settlement with Slade, there were days, a lot of days, when I had stopped looking for a way out. When I had accepted what he told me, which was that nobody was coming, nobody had come, nobody was going to come." She paused. "That's not a small thing to accept. It changes you, accepting that. It changes the size of the world you're willing to live in." He set the saddle down and looked at her. "I'm telling you that because I want you to understand that what he did wasn't just keeping me from you, it was making me small enough to stay." She met his eyes. "And I stayed. Not because I was helpless, because I had been made to believe that small was all there was." "Evelyn, I'm not saying it to make you angry," she said. "I'm saying it because I want you to understand what you're actually going to find when you get there. A place that's built to make people small." She turned back to the horse. "Know what that looks like before you see it, so it doesn't surprise you into doing something we'll both regret." He stood there for a moment. "You are not small," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not anymore." "You weren't before either." "I know." She put her hand on the gelding's nose. "But I had to remember that from the inside. Nobody could hand it back to me." She looked at him over the horse's neck. "That's actually the part that took the longest." He nodded. He picked up the saddle again. They worked in the barn in a comfortable and complicated silence for another 20 minutes, the horse moving quietly, the lantern making everything amber. And then she went inside and he finished what he was doing and stood for a moment in the barn door looking at the house. The light in the kitchen, the dark windows of the upstairs rooms, the porch with its empty swing. Wednesday came fast. They left in the pre-dawn dark, the three of them, Gideon and Shaw and the younger Delaney brother, a solid, quiet man named Cal who had earned his reputation over a decade of frontier work and who asked no unnecessary questions. Evelyn was on the porch when they rode out. She didn't wave. She stood with her blanket and her coffee, and she watched them go. Tobias stood beside her. He had gotten up early without being asked. He stood in his nightclothes in the cold with his arms crossed, which was the Tobias Blackwood version of dignity in difficult moments. When the three riders reached the gate and went through, he said without turning, "He'll be okay." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Shaw too." "Yes." A pause. "I'm hungry," Tobias said. "I know," she said. "Come inside." They went inside. Behind them, the gate stood open the way it had been left, the riders already too far in the gray pre-dawn to see. The wind came across the scrubland with the particular November edge that meant real cold was not far off, and the porch swing moved slightly in it, the right side giving its small, reliable creak into the empty morning air. The 4 days of riding north were the kind of days that strip a journey down to its functional components: weather, terrain, the specific discomfort of cold mornings, and the specific relief of campfires at night. Cal Delaney navigated by the features of the Harrow Range with the easy competence of a man who had worked that country in his 20s, and Shaw confirmed what Cal described. And Gideon rode mostly in silence, which neither man commented on because they had both known him long enough to understand what his silence meant, and that it wasn't their job to fill it. What Gideon was doing in the silence was managing. He was managing what Evelyn had told him, not the facts of it, because he could hold facts at arm's length, at least temporarily, but the accumulated weight of imagining the things she had described. A place built to make people small, a man who had watched a woman believe his lies for years, a particular cruelty that didn't require violence because it worked through subtraction, subtracting options, subtracting history, subtracting the person's knowledge of their own size. He rode north and managed what he felt about that, and thought about what she had said. Know what you're going to find before you find it, so it doesn't surprise you into something we'll both regret. He was trying. On the fourth afternoon, Cal pulled up at a ridgeline and said, "There." Below them, in the canyon's fold, was the settlement. It was smaller than Gideon had imagined, a cluster of structures, a main building, 2 or 3 outbuildings, a corral, smoke from a chimney, a single figure moving between the corral and the main building, too far to identify. "How many people, you reckon?" Shaw said. "Hard to say from here," Cal said. "Might be 6, might be 12. Settlements like this turn over. People come through for a season and move on." "Slade himself," Gideon said. "You think he's there?" "Smoke in the chimney in November," Cal said. "That's a man who's home." They came down into the canyon from the eastern approach, which Cal said was the least visible line of entry and which turned out to be correct. They were at the main building's door before the figure from the corral had time to do more than shout once. The man who opened the door was not Vernon Slade. He was younger, 40 maybe, a weathered ranch type who looked at the 3 armed men on his porch with the flat assessment of someone calculating odds rather than feeling fear. "We're looking for Vernon Slade," Gideon said. "Who's asking?" "Gideon Blackwood, from Red Mesa Crossing." Something moved in the man's eyes. Recognition, quickly suppressed. He knew the name, which meant Slade had talked, which meant Slade had known, or known enough, about where Evelyn had gone. "He's not here," the man said. "When did he leave?" A pause. "Few days back." "Where?" "Doesn't tell me his business." Gideon looked at him for a moment. "Here's my business," he said. "I'm going to search this property, and I'm going to take whatever documents I find relating to a woman Vernon Slade kept here against her will, and then I'm going to find Vernon Slade and bring him back out to Red Mesa Crossing to answer for what he did. If you help me, I'll remember that. If you don't—" He stopped. "I'll remember that too." The man looked at the 3 of them. He looked at Shaw, who was watching the property perimeter with the specific quality of attention of a man who does it professionally. He looked at Cal. He stepped back from the door. They found the documents in the back room of the main building, in a locked box that Cal opened with the kind of expedient efficiency that suggested he had opened locked boxes before. Inside were papers, names, dates, a ledger of some kind that Gideon didn't fully understand, but that Shaw, looking over his shoulder, said quietly, "That's not good. That's not just one woman." Gideon looked at him. "There are entries going back 15 years, Shaw said. He wasn't being dramatic about it. He was stating a fact in the voice of a man who would rather not be stating it. This man has done this before." Gideon looked at the ledger. The entry for Evelyn. She was listed under the name he had given her, Clara, with an arrival date that corresponded to roughly 2 weeks after the flood, which meant he had found her and made his decision in that window, quickly, with a specificity of intent that made what Gideon was managing in the silence considerably harder to manage. He closed the ledger. He put it under his arm. He looked at the man still standing in the doorway of the main room, who was watching him with the careful stillness of someone waiting to find out what kind of trouble he was in. "Slade," Gideon said. "Where would he go? If he was leaving this settlement, where does he go?" The man was quiet for a long time. Shaw said, not loudly, "The ledger is going to a territorial judge. Anyone in it is going to be asked about their involvement. That includes everyone on this property." He paused. "Unless, of course, they were helpful." Another silence. The man said, "There's a trading post, south rim of the Harrow, day and a half's ride. He runs supplies through there sometimes." He looked at the floor. "He might stop there if he's heading south." "How long ago did he leave?" 3 days. Gideon did the math. A man with 3 days' head start, potentially heading south toward Red Mesa, toward where he now knew Evelyn was. Not running, coming. He looked at Shaw. Shaw's face said, "Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing." Cal was already moving toward the horses. The ride south was faster than the ride north had been, because urgency is a different kind of fuel from purpose. They pushed the horses harder than was comfortable and made the trading post in a day rather than a day and a half, arriving in the late afternoon when the light was going orange and slanted, and the post itself was a single low building with two horses tied outside. One of them was a horse that the trading post owner, a large and curious man named Birch, confirmed had come in 3 days ago with a man matching Slade's description. "He's still here?" Cal said. "Went back into the supply room to sleep off some whiskey a few hours ago," Birch said, with the complete detachment of a man who does not consider other people's business to be his problem. Shaw went left. Cal went right. Gideon went through the middle. Vernon Slade was not asleep. He was sitting on a crate in the back room with his back to the far wall and a rifle across his knees, which told Gideon that Slade had known someone might be coming, had been waiting for it, and had chosen to wait in a room with only one entrance rather than run. Gideon stopped in the doorway. Slade looked at him. He was older than Evelyn's description had prepared Gideon for, or maybe he just looked older than his years, the way men look when they've spent decades living hard in cold country. Light eyes, watchful, the face from Evelyn's dream. "Blackwood," Slade said. He said it the way he'd said Evelyn's name, probably. Flat, controlled, already knowing more than he should. "Good. Slade," Gideon said. "Come to settle something?" "Come to bring you back," Gideon said. Slade looked at the rifle across his knees. He looked at Gideon. He did his calculation, the one he could hear coming in through the only door and the solid walls on 3 sides, and the options available to a man in that room. "She sent you," Slade said. "She told me where to find you," Gideon said. "That's different." "Is it?" "Yes." Gideon's voice was completely flat. "She's in Red Mesa Crossing with her name and her son in a territorial court declaration. She doesn't need me to do anything for her. I'm here because what you did to her is in a ledger that lists 14 other names over 15 years, and a territorial judge is going to want to talk to you about all of them." He paused. "The rifle doesn't help you. There are 2 more men outside this room, and we're all going back to Red Mesa Crossing. The only question is the condition you're in when we get there." Slade looked at him for a long moment. "You could have just killed me," he said. "Would have been simpler." "Yes," Gideon said. "It would have." He held Slade's gaze and didn't move. The seconds were long in the cold back room of the trading post, with the light going out through the small high window and Shaw and Cal somewhere on the other side of the wall. Slade set the rifle on the floor. It was not a dramatic gesture. He just set it down, carefully, with both hands, and looked at the wall rather than at Gideon, and that was the end of it. Not the end of everything, not the end of what he had to face, but the end of the particular thing that had required 3 men and 4 days north, and a ledger and Evelyn's voice in the barn the night before they left, telling Gideon to know what he was going to find before he found it. He'd found it. He stood in the doorway of the supply room and looked at the man who had taken 8 years from his wife and built a world around her absence and told her nobody was searching, and he felt what he felt, which was enormous and would have to wait. And then he stepped aside and called for Cal, and they did what they had come to do. They brought Slade into Red Mesa Crossing on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after they'd left, and the town noticed. It was impossible not to notice. 3 riders and a 4th man with his hands bound to his saddle horn, coming down the main street at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual, but the specific, deliberate pace of men completing something they had started. Shaw rode on one side of Slade, Cal Delaney on the other, and Gideon rode slightly ahead, which told anyone watching who was responsible for whatever this was. People stopped on the sidewalk. The feed store owner came to his doorway. 2 women near the millinery turned to watch. A boy ran ahead down the street the way boys do when something is happening and they want to be the first to know what it is. Gideon did not look left or right. He rode to Judge Pryor's office, dismounted, handed his reins to Cal, and went inside. Pryor was at his desk. He looked up, registered Gideon's face, and set his pen down without finishing what he'd been writing. "I need to file charges," Gideon said. "Unlawful detention, identity fraud, and whatever else the territorial code applies to a man who has done this to 14 women over 15 years. He set the ledger on Pryor's desk. "It's all in there." Pryor looked at the ledger. He looked at Gideon. He reached out and opened it. The room was quiet while he read. After several minutes, he looked up. "Where is he?" Outside, Gideon said, cooperated fully on the way back. Didn't fight, didn't run. I think he's done calculating and came up empty. Pryor looked at the ledger again. He turned a few more pages. His face did something complicated and then settled into the particular professional neutrality of a judge who has decided to do his job. I'll need Evelyn's formal testimony, he said, before we can hold him. She'll give it, Gideon said. You're certain? She told me to bring him back, Gideon said, so she could do exactly that. Yes, I'm certain. Evelyn was on the porch when Gideon rode through the Blackwood gate that afternoon, which meant Tobias had been watching from somewhere and had gone to tell her, because she was not a woman who sat waiting on porches as a habit. She was standing at the railing with her arms crossed and her face doing the controlled thing it did when she was feeling something large and keeping it at an appropriate size. Gideon dismounted. She looked at him, his face first, reading it the way she had been reading it for weeks, quickly and thoroughly. She looked at his hands, his posture, the way he walked toward the porch steps. You're all right, she said. I'm all right. Shaw? Fine. Dropped Cal at the livery. Slade is in Pryor's custody. She exhaled. It was a small sound, but it was the sound of something that had been held under significant pressure finding a way out. The ledger, she said. Pryor has it. He read it? Enough of it. She nodded. She looked out at the gate, then back at him. 14 other names, she said. Yes. She had known that was coming. He'd sent a message ahead with Cal, but knowing and hearing it confirmed were different weights. She stood with it for a moment, and Gideon stood at the bottom of the porch steps and let her. Those women, she said. Pryor's already talking about sending notifications, Gideon said. It's going to take time. Some of them might not. Some of them might not want to be found. It's complicated. I know it's complicated. She looked at him. I was one of them. He nodded. She uncrossed her arms and came down the porch steps. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face carefully, the way she'd looked at him in the barn the night before he left. The specific look of someone taking inventory of another person's interior damage. You didn't do anything stupid, she said. It wasn't a question exactly. No. You wanted to. Yes. But you didn't. No. He met her eyes. You told me not to. I decided that mattered more than what I wanted. She looked at him for another moment. Then she put her hand on his arm. Not a dramatic gesture, not a long embrace, just her hand on his arm for a few seconds, the way people touch each other when words are inadequate and something physical needs to cross the space between them. Then she stepped back. I need to talk to Pryor, she said. Not today, Gideon said. Tomorrow. She started to argue. Evelyn. His voice was quiet. One day. Eat supper, sleep in your own bed, let me look at you across a table that isn't a judge's bench. He paused. Then tomorrow. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted. Not surrender, something more like the conscious choice to accept something being offered rather than push past it. One day, she said. One day, he said. Tobias appeared in the doorway at exactly that moment, which suggested he had been listening from approximately 2 feet inside the front door. He looked at his father with the comprehensive assessment of a 9-year-old who has been managing his own anxiety for 11 days. You look terrible, he told Gideon. Thank you, son. Did you eat anything up there? Some. Dot made a pie, Tobias said, with the tone of someone delivering critical intelligence. She made it yesterday, but she said it would keep. Tell Dot I'll eat 2 pieces, Gideon said. Tobias went back inside to deliver this message with a gravity that suggested he understood it was important. Gideon looked at Evelyn. She was almost smiling. Not quite, but close enough that he could see the shape of it. He's been worried about you, she said. I know. He didn't say so. I know that too. They went inside. The second hearing was not like the first. The first hearing had been about whether Evelyn existed, whether the woman behind the mercantile was who she said she was, whether her memories were real or manufactured, whether Gideon Blackwood had lost his mind or found his wife. The room had been full of people who hadn't decided yet, and Silas Crowder had been at his table with Bates and his patient, erosive questions, and the whole thing had the quality of a verdict that could go either way. The second hearing had a different atmosphere entirely. Crowder was not there. He had no standing in this proceeding and had apparently understood that showing up would do him more harm than staying away, which was the first smart calculation he'd made in months. The gallery was smaller because Pryor had limited attendance to those with direct relevance, but the faces that were there were different. Margaret Holt, Shaw, the Delaney brothers, Dr. Fitch, who had come back from the regional office apparently because he felt a professional obligation to see the case through. And at the back, against the wall, 3 women Gideon didn't recognize who turned out to be territorial advocates for exactly this kind of case, women who had been notified by Pryor's office the day after the ledger arrived. Slade sat at the defendant's table with a territorial-appointed attorney who was doing his best with a poor hand. Slade himself looked smaller than he had in the supply room doorway. Not physically, he was the same size, but in the specific way that men look smaller when the structure they built around themselves has been taken down and they're standing in the open without it. He didn't look at Evelyn when she came in. She looked at him. She sat in the witness chair with the cloth rabbit in her hands, and she looked at Vernon Slade the way she had looked at Silas Crowder in the first hearing, directly, without performance, with the calm of someone who has decided what they think and is no longer expending energy on deciding it. Pryor led her through the foundation, who she was, the flood, the events already established in the previous hearing. Then he moved forward in time into the territory that had never been in a courtroom before. "Tell me," he said, "what you remember about the period following the flood." She told it. She told it plainly and in order, the way she had told Gideon in the kitchen and later in his room in the dark. The bank, the lantern, the man crouching beside her. The days that followed, which she described with the specific detail of someone whose memory had returned in full once the wall had come down. The way Slade had managed her confusion, the name he'd given her, the story he'd constructed about her past, or lack of it. The settlement in the canyon, the other people there, some of whom had been in similar circumstances, some of whom simply chose not to ask questions about other people's business. She described the years. She did not minimize them, and she did not dramatize them. She said, "He told me nobody had searched for me." She said, "I believed him because I had no way to measure the lie against anything." She said, "The settlement was built on the premise that people there did not have histories worth returning to, and he maintained that premise carefully." The room was very quiet. She said, "I don't know exactly when I began to understand that something was wrong. It came slowly. Things that didn't add up. Things he said that contradicted other things he'd said. The way he responded when I asked certain questions, not with answers, but with the specific kind of redirection that, once you notice it, you cannot stop noticing." She said, "I left in the night. I took only the rabbit because the rabbit was mine in a way I couldn't explain but couldn't leave behind." She said, "I made my way south over several months, working where I could, moving when I could move. I didn't know where I was going. I was going away from there, and away was all the direction I had." She said, "I ended up in Red Mesa Crossing with a tin cup and 9 cents and a borrowed name, sitting behind a mercantile. And a boy stopped beside me, and I heard him hum something that I recognized from somewhere I couldn't name, and then a man crouched down and turned my wrist over, and the rest of it, you know." She looked up from her hands. She looked at Vernon Slade. He was looking at the table in front of him now. "I want to say one more thing," she said, "not as testimony, as I want him to hear something." Pryor looked at her. He nodded. She kept her eyes on Slade. "You told me nobody would come," she said. "You told me that whatever life I'd had before, it was done, it was gone, that there was nothing to go back to and nobody looking." She paused. "My son was 9 months old when the flood took me. He's 10 years old now. He stopped on a street and heard a song and stood still because something in him recognized what his mind didn't remember. And that's how wrong you were." She stopped. "That's all." Slade did not look up. His attorney said a few things. They did not significantly help. The territorial advocates presented the ledger in full. Pryor read sections into the record. 2 witnesses from the Canyon settlement who had been brought south by territorial marshals the previous week gave testimony about what they had seen and known over years of living adjacent to what Slade had built. Their testimony was imperfect. People living in that kind of settlement had their own complicated reasons for being there, and they were not entirely clean hands. But it was corroborating, and corroboration was what the ledger needed to become a conviction rather than a record. The deliberation took less than 2 hours. Slade was convicted on multiple counts. The sentence Pryor handed down was the maximum available under territorial law, which was not the maximum Gideon had privately wanted, but which was, as he had told Evelyn in the barn, the thing that would outlast everything else. It was permanent. It was documented. It was on record in a territorial court in a way that could not be undone by anything Slade said or paid or arranged, because the ledger was now in territorial custody, and the ledger was its own argument. Slade was taken out of the courtroom without drama. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at Evelyn on his way out. She watched him go with the specific quality of attention of someone making sure a door is fully closed before turning away from it. Then she turned away. Margaret Holt was beside her almost immediately, which Gideon suspected was not accidental. Margaret Holt did not do accidental things in rooms where they mattered. She put her hand on Evelyn's arm and said something low, and Evelyn nodded, and the two of them stood there for a moment. The old seamstress and the woman she'd fitted for a wedding dress a decade ago, with the particular companionship of women who have known each other across a rupture. Shaw appeared at Gideon's shoulder. "Well," Shaw said. "Well," Gideon said, "that's done then. That part is." Shaw looked at him sidelong. "You gonna be all right?" Gideon thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm working on it," he said. "That's the most honest thing I can tell you." Shaw nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said, and meant it as one. Silas Crowder's collapse came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the slow, inexorable arithmetic of a man who has miscalculated his community. He had spent months engineering the narrative that Gideon Blackwood had lost his mind, and the community had partially believed him. But partial belief in a small frontier town has a short half-life when events keep accumulating against it. The first hearing had shifted things. The return of Slade and the second hearing shifted them further. And the ledger, whose content spread through Red Mesa Crossing the way all significant information spread in a town with one main street, finished the job. People who had nodded along with Crowder's concern began to remember, uncomfortably, that they had nodded along. People who had called Gideon desperate and delusional found themselves on the wrong side of a story that had resolved publicly and completely, which is one of the more socially costly positions a person in a small community can occupy. Crowder's bank didn't close. He was too well established for that, and money has a durability that reputation doesn't always have. But his influence in the rooms where influence was exercised quietly began to thin, and the men who had sat at his table because it was advantageous began finding reasons to sit elsewhere. He had always operated on the premise that Gideon Blackwood's vulnerability was exploitable, and it had turned out not to be. And in Red Mesa Crossing, that verdict was permanent. Gideon neither celebrated this nor pursued it. He had enough to do at Blackwood Ranch without cataloging Crowder's losses. And more importantly, he had learned something in the previous months about what he actually wanted to spend his attention on, which was a different set of things than he'd spent it on for 8 years. The cattle and the land still mattered. They were the engine of everything, the practical reality that put food on tables and kept the ranch functioning. But they were not, as they had been during the empty years, the entire content of a life. They were the frame. The rest of it had come back, imperfect and complicated and real. November moved into December, and December into a winter that was hard in the way frontier winters are hard. Not dramatic, just relentless. The cold pressing in from every edge. The work doubling because cold weather multiplies the things that can go wrong on a working ranch. Evelyn worked through it. That was the thing Gideon kept coming back to, in the quiet way that observations accumulate before a person articulates them. She worked through it. Not performing recovery, not taking each day as a meaningful milestone. Just working, the way she had always worked, with the particular focused practicality of a woman who has decided what needs doing and is doing it. She and Dot had arrived at a functional partnership that Gideon suspected neither of them would have described as warm. Dot was not a warm woman, and Evelyn was not currently a soft one, but which was deeply practical and occasionally punctuated by the specific dry humor of two women who have independently arrived at the conclusion that most problems can be addressed with sufficient coffee and a realistic assessment of the available options. Tobias had gone back to school and was applying himself to the business of being ordinary with the same focused stubbornness he applied to everything. The other children had adjusted the way children adjust, faster than adults, less neatly, with the casual cruelty and casual acceptance existing simultaneously that characterizes how children navigate anything they don't understand but are told to live alongside. Nathan Pryor had said nothing further worth repeating. The Delaney children had apparently decided Tobias was more interesting now than he had been before, which was not the metric Gideon would have chosen, but which produced the practical outcome of his son having people to eat lunch with, so he declined to examine it too closely. The nightmares came less often for Evelyn as January settled in. She didn't mark the change explicitly. She told Gideon about it only obliquely, saying one morning that she'd slept straight through, as if reporting a weather event rather than a significant personal development. He said he was glad. She poured her coffee and agreed, and they ate breakfast and discussed the fence line in the north pasture that needed attention before the spring thaw, which was not a romantic conversation but was, he was coming to understand, the texture of real life as opposed to the life of a story. The fence lines and the cold coffee and the list of things that need doing, inhabited by people who are still in the process of becoming who they're going to be. One evening in late January, Tobias came downstairs after he was supposed to be asleep and found both his parents in the kitchen. Gideon was at the table with the ranch accounts. Evelyn was by the stove with a cup of something warm and a piece of leatherwork she'd been repairing for one of the bridals. Neither of them was talking. The lamp was on. Outside, the winter wind was doing its usual indifferent work against the windows. Tobias stood in the kitchen doorway in his nightclothes and looked at the two of them for a moment. "I just wanted to see," he said. "See what?" Gideon said without looking up from the accounts. "This," Tobias said. "I just wanted to see this." Evelyn looked at him. Gideon looked up. Tobias turned and went back upstairs. The two of them sat in the kitchen for a moment with the ordinary, extraordinary fact of what their son had just said, and neither of them spoke, because some things have the quality of a gift that talking would diminish. Gideon set down his pen. Evelyn set down the bridle. The lamp burned between them on the table, and the winter pressed against the windows, and Blackwood Ranch sat in the dark territory the way it had always sat. The same fences and the same scrubland and the same cold sky full of the same stars, but with a different weight inside it. The specific gravity of a house where something has been returned that was gone. It was not a perfect weight. There were still mornings when Evelyn reached for the shape of a memory and found only its outline. There were still evenings when Gideon sat with the 8 years between them and felt them the way you feel scar tissue. Not pain exactly, but a reminder of where the damage had been. There were still conversations they had not yet found the right way to have, things that needed more time before they could be said without breaking something that was still knitting. None of that was gone. But Tobias had come downstairs at 10 o'clock in his nightclothes to look at his parents sitting in the same kitchen, and that was its own answer to something. Spring came the way springs come on the frontier, not gently, but as a matter of fact, the cold simply stopping, the land turning from gray-brown to something that remembered green, the horses moving differently in the paddock as if they too were adjusting to the change in atmospheric pressure. The gray gelding followed Evelyn from fence rail to fence rail on the first warm morning like a dog, which Shaw observed from 30 feet away, and then looked at the ground and said nothing, which for Shaw was a significant display of feeling. She had been working the horse breeding operation back into something serious for 3 months by then. Gideon had stepped back from it deliberately, not because he was ceding territory, but because he had recognized something he hadn't known about his wife before the flood, or had known and failed to fully understand, which was that she did not simply have an instinct for horses. She had a philosophy about them, a complete and specific theory of how animals learn and what they need and how a breeding program should be built, and it was better than his. He had been doing it adequately in her absence. She was going to do it well, and the difference between adequate and well on a working ranch over a decade was significant. He told her that directly one afternoon, in the barn, in the way he had learned to say things directly, rather than managing them into a shape he could control. She looked at him for a moment. "You're not bothered by that?" she said. "Should I be?" She tilted her head slightly. "Some men would be." "Some men," he said, "haven't spent 8 years learning what matters." She held his gaze. Something in her settled, not all the way, not permanently, but visibly. "I'm still figuring out how to be here," she said. "In the way I mean, not legally. How to be here as a person who gets to stay, who isn't waiting to be told she has to go." "You get to stay," he said. "I know that. In my head, I know that." She looked at the horse. "The rest of me is still catching up." "Take the time," he said. You keep saying that. Because I keep meaning it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm not the same woman who rode into the flood. No, he said. And you're not the same man. No, he said. I'm not. So we're not picking up where we left off. That's not what this is. I know that. Then what is it? She said. Not with distress, but the genuine question of a person who has been honest with themselves about what they don't yet know. He thought about it. He looked at the barn rafters for a moment, then back at her. It's two people who know each other from before, he said, trying to figure out if they can know each other now. He paused. I think they can, but I'm not going to decide that for you. She looked at him for a long time. That's the most patient thing you've ever said, she said. I've had 8 years to practice not having what I want, he said. Turns out that's useful for something. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. They weren't there yet. Not with everything. Not with the full ease of two people whose history has no damage in it. But the architecture of a laugh and the warmth of it in the barn in the first spring morning was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. The river was still there in April, running full with snowmelt from the ranges. Evelyn went to see it on a Sunday afternoon, which Gideon didn't know until Tobias found him in the equipment shed and said, She went to the river. He looked up. She went alone, Tobias said. I saw her go. She didn't ask anyone to come. Gideon set down what he was holding. Should we follow her? Tobias said. He thought about it. He thought about what she had told him in the barn the night before he'd ridden north, about how she had remembered herself from the inside and how nobody could hand that back to her. He thought about what he'd understood, slowly, over the months since the hearing, that the most significant thing he could do for a woman who had spent years being managed was to stop managing. No, he said, we let her go. Tobias accepted this with the seriousness he accepted things that mattered. He sat down on an upturned bucket and picked up a piece of rope and began tying and untying it, which was what he did when he was thinking. Father, he said after a while. Yeah. I'm glad you stopped. Gideon looked at him. When you walked past her, Tobias said, behind the mercantile. I'm glad you stopped and came back. He didn't look up from the rope. I almost didn't say anything. Gideon was quiet for a moment. What made you say something? Tobias considered this seriously. The song, he said, and the way she held the rabbit, but also, he stopped, tied a knot, untied it. She looked like she'd been somewhere very far away and had finally stopped, like she was too tired to keep going, but she didn't know where to stop. And I thought, he looked up. I thought, that's somebody's person, even if I didn't know yet whose. Gideon looked at his son, at this 10-year-old who had stopped on a Saturday street and held still when every practical instinct said, keep walking. And he thought about what it cost a child to believe in something the entire adult world around him was calling impossible, and how Tobias had done it anyway, with the specific stubbornness of a boy who had decided and was not revisiting it. You changed everything, Gideon said. You know that. Tobias shrugged, the way children shrug when they've done something significant and don't know what to do with being told. Somebody had to stop, he said. Evelyn came back from the river an hour later. She came through the front gate and up toward the house, and her boots were muddy at the hem where she'd stood too close to the water's edge, and her hair had come partially loose in the wind, and she looked, not peaceful exactly, because peace was too clean a word for what she'd been working through. She looked like a person who has stood in front of something large and difficult and decided not to be afraid of it anymore, which is a specific kind of resolution that shows in the body before it shows in the face. She found Gideon and Tobias still in the equipment shed, which surprised her. She had expected the house. What are you doing in here? She said. Waiting, Tobias said. She looked at Gideon. Waiting, he confirmed. She looked at both of them. Something moved across her face that was complicated and clear at the same time. The expression of a person receiving something they had stopped expecting to receive, which is different from receiving it for the first time because it has the weight of absence inside it. The river's high, she said. Snowmelt. Yes, Gideon said. I stood there for a while. She looked at her muddy boots. I was waiting to feel something terrible. I thought I would. She looked up. Mostly I just felt wet. The wind was cold. Did that help? Tobias asked. She thought about it. Yes, actually, she said. A little. Tobias nodded as if this confirmed something he'd considered. Then he got off his bucket and said, "Dot's gonna want us for supper," and walked out of the shed toward the house, rope still in hand. The two of them watched him go. "That boy," Evelyn said. "Yes," Gideon said. She stood in the shed doorway for a moment, the spring light behind her, the mud on her boots, her hair loose and windblown. She was not the woman in the dirt behind the mercantile. She was also not yet the woman she had been before the flood, because that woman existed in the past, and the past could not be fully recovered, only honored. She was the woman she was becoming, which was something specific and hard-won and entirely her own, built from the flood and the dark years and the canyon settlement and the long road south and the tin cup and the rabbit and a child who had stopped walking on a Saturday afternoon because something in him knew what to recognize. She was Evelyn Blackwood. She had been Evelyn Blackwood in the dirt behind the mercantile too, even when nobody knew it, even when she didn't know it, even when a man had spent years trying to convince her she was someone smaller and someone else. She had carried it the whole time, in the song she hummed and the rabbit she held, and the way she stood up straight the moment someone helped her to her feet. That was the thing about identity. The real kind, not the kind on a court document, not the kind a judge declares. It doesn't require witnesses. It doesn't disappear because the person carrying it has forgotten it temporarily. It waits. And sometimes it takes a child stopping on a street to recognize what the rest of the world has agreed to consider gone. Gideon held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it, the same way she had taken it on the courthouse steps. Not dramatically, not as a resolution, but as the simple physical fact of two people choosing to cross the distance between them. They walked toward the house together in the April evening, the light going gold across the scrubland, the gray gelding watching them from the paddock fence, the porch swing waiting with its familiar creak held in reserve. Inside, Dot was calling for supper. Tobias's voice answered from upstairs, something about his boots, which Dot was apparently not satisfied with. The ordinary noise of a house with people in it. Imperfect people. People still in the process of becoming. People who had cost each other things, and been cost things in return, and were choosing to move forward without the fiction that none of it had happened. Evelyn stopped at the porch steps and looked up at the house for a moment. At the rose-patterned curtains visible through the front window, the left side still bunching where the rod had always been uneven. At the porch swing. At the warm light in the kitchen window. "I used to think about this," she said, "in the dark years. Not with my mind. I didn't remember it. But somewhere underneath. I used to feel the shape of somewhere I was supposed to be, and I didn't know what it was." She looked at him. "Now I know what it was." "Is it the same," he said, "as you imagined?" She looked at the bunching curtains, the uneven rod she had chosen and he had never fixed. She looked at the porch swing. She thought about Dot inside, and Tobias's voice arguing about boots, and the gray gelding at the fence, and the kitchen table with its cold coffee and its slow, unfinished conversations. "No," she said, "it's better." She wasn't saying it was perfect. She was saying that the real thing, imperfect, complicated, marked by everything that had happened to it, was better than the clean version a mind constructs in the dark to survive. Because the clean version doesn't have Tobias arguing about boots. It doesn't have Shaw's dry observations or Dot's wordless competence or the gray gelding's particular opinion about who he trusts. It doesn't have Gideon learning, at considerable cost, how to hold things loosely enough for them to stay. She went up the porch steps. She pushed open the front door of Blackwood Ranch, and Evelyn Blackwood, who had been swallowed by a river and returned by a child's recognition, who had survived the years between by carrying herself in a song she didn't remember learning, walked back into her own life and stayed.